Welcome to the May 26, 2020 Planning Commission meeting. Like the past two Planning Commission meetings, we are operating in a virtual environment. I'd like to ask for patience as we use this platform for our public meetings. There may be slight delays as we transition between speakers and participants. If any participants have issues with the technology, please send a message to the moderator. For each item, staff will provide a presentation. The applicant will then be invited to speak. As in the case for our in-person meetings, the applicant and those in favor will have a total of 10 minutes to speak on a particular item. Those opposed will also have a total of 10 minutes to speak. Each speaker other than the applicant will be allowed 2 minutes to speak. We ask that speakers do not duplicate comments, and after all comments, the applicant will have 2 additional minutes to respond to issues or questions raised. At the conclusion of each portion, Planning Commission members can ask questions. I would ask that the commissioners hold all questions until the conclusion of each presentation. I would also ask that each commissioner be recognized by the chairperson before speaking. If you have any technical questions, please send a message to the host through chat. We begin our meetings with an opportunity for persons to address the Planning Commission and speak on any matter that's not on our agenda. We don't have anyone signed up to speak today, so we'll move on to the consent agenda. The consent agenda is a list of requests that can be acted upon together. Instead of acting on each request individually, the Commission can approve the items with one motion and vote. All of the items on the consent agenda today are to move requests from the Committee of the Whole to the Planning Commission. Committee of the Whole is not currently conducting virtual meetings. These items will be placed on a future Planning Commission agenda for full discussion. To be clear, the Commission is not voting on the final disposition of any of these requests. Before I ask for a motion, does any Commission member want to speak out about any or all of the items on the consent agenda? I didn't give you that opportunity last time. I want to make sure that I didn't miss that opportunity this time. So please raise your hand if you have anything to say. All right, moving on. With that, I ask for a motion to approve the items on the consent agenda. Would anyone like to make the motion? All right, I see Commissioner Miller's hand up first. I'm sorry, I missed you, Ms. Hicks. You can second if you like. Commissioner Miller, could you please make the motion?
I move to approve the items on the consent agenda.
And do we have all right, we have a second. And so I ask at this time for Janitha to produce or to do a roll call for members to record their individual votes. And at the end of the roll call, I will announce the outcome of the vote.
Okay, Commissioner Bennett, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Fox, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Hicks, how do you vote?
Aye.
Chair Jeffrey, how do you vote?
Aye. Aye.
Commissioner Lampman, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Mann, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner McIntosh, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Miller, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Winters, how do you vote?
Aye.
So the motion to approve the consent agenda passes unanimously. Mr. Crane, is that the right procedure before we go on, since this is a new procedure for us?
That's perfect. Thank you.
Welcome. Okay. We'll now begin with the old business portion of the agenda. These are requests that have appeared on previous Planning Commission agendas. The first item is C1, case number Z5319 Thornton Road on the south side, 1/4 mile east of Wildwood Forest Drive. This is a request to rezone approximately 15.3 acres from residential 4 to residential 10 conditional use. And we have from staff Mr. Mr. Agnost. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I'm
you got
sorry,
it.
John. I am not, I'm still struggling with that. I
No,
apologize.
that's good. Oh, good morning. This is case Z-53-19, a request to rezone 15.3 acres from residential 4 to residential 10 with conditions. Those 15.3 acres are made up of portions of 2 different parcels. As you can see in the map there, and you'll see a little bit better on the next slide. This did receive a CAC vote, which was against. And the last time you saw this case was on March the 10th. It has not appeared since then. And so I will go through the presentation in full because I think there are some new commission members today. So the next slide shows the location a little bit closer. And so you can see the request is for a portion of 2 parcels. And so there are in the southeast boundary with an adjacent neighborhood, and then on the northwest another boundary, and those will come up in the zoning conditions. And this area is mostly residential. There is a solid waste transfer station on the north side of Thornton Road that handles mostly household waste. So the next slide will show us the larger area. And so this site is in the area in the northeast quadrant of Capitol Boulevard and Perry Creek Road. So Capitol Boulevard is just off the left side of the image there. And again, you can see this area is largely residential. The site is at the east end of Thornton Road before it reaches a City of Raleigh Park property that is planned to be a park at some point in the future, though there is no master plan funded or programmed for that at this time. So that is undefined when that would become a park. And then you can see there is a little bit of commercial development closer to Capitol Boulevard and the Wildwood Forest Elementary School to the west. And to clarify some of the emails that you may have seen in relation to this case, the neighborhood to the west of the site, in between the site and Wildwood Forest Elementary, is the park at Perry Creek. So if you see emails from folks from the park at Perry Creek, that's that neighborhood. And then to the southeast towards the Thornton Road property, that neighborhood is called Castleberry. So next slide, please. Here you can see a little closer. So the area within the rezoning proposal is pretty much fully wooded at this time. Next slide. Here you can see it from the street. So there are 2 stub streets that reach the rezoning property. One from the Castleberry neighborhood called Brambleberry Way, and one from the park at Perry Creek called Noose Forest Road. And then the site does have direct frontage onto Thornton Road. Next slide, please. So you may have seen a memo from the Stormwater Division in the agenda materials. And so the Castleberry neighborhood to the southeast has had issues with the stormwater facility that was installed when their neighborhood was subdivided and constructed. And they have worked with the Stormwater Division to do some re-engineering of that facility since the neighborhood was turned over to the Property Owners Association. And so the nature of that is that at the east end of the neighborhood, that is where the drainage leads to, and there were some issues with that that device not properly draining, and that is being improved. And the other thing that the Stormwater Division noted about this is that those issues are not likely caused by the rezoning site. But we'll talk about that in the conditions in a moment. Next slide, please. And the 2 slides are just giving more detail about the stormwater facilities in the area. We can pass through those unless there are any questions at the moment about stormwater. Okay. Next slide, please. So this is the first slide of conditions. There are 9 conditions offered, limiting overall density of the development, setting a maximum number of units that can be in a single building, and then prohibiting use of nearby streets by construction vehicles except for Thornton Road, prohibiting some uses and the apartment building type. The next condition on the next slide is improving the stormwater control requirements. And then there are 2 conditions requiring landscape areas along the boundaries with the park at Perry Creek and Castleberry. And it is worthwhile to note that the offered condition for a landscape area adjacent to the park at Perry Creek cannot offer that for the entire area where the parent parcels are adjacent to the park at Perry Creek, because not the entirety of those parcels are not included in the rezoning request. So the request requires a landscape yard with a fence for the entire length of its boundary that's within the scope of the rezoning. Next slide, please. And here you can see the entitlement difference between the existing zoning and the proposed zoning. So nearly doubling the density, and that density would be allowed in single-family duplex or townhouse buildings, the apartment building type prohibited by the offered condition, and the maximum entitlement with the proposed zoning will be up to 114 units. Next slide, please. So the future land use map for this site is low density residential, which recommends a maximum density of 6 units per acre and does not recommend the townhouse or apartment building types. And so this request is inconsistent with that because the allowed density would be greater than 6 units per acre and it would allow townhouses. Next slide, please. There is no urban form designated in the area around this site, so no policies to reference there. Next slide, please. Overall, the request is consistent with the comprehensive plan, inconsistent with the future land use map, as I've just noted. Next slide, please. The consistent policies relate to having appropriate compatible uses adjacent to existing neighborhoods and having buffers in between new development that is slightly different and existing development. Next slide. The inconsistent policies are related to the future land use map, also the allowance of townhouses in an area that does have a predominantly single-family character, although the density is in some places a little bit higher than the low-density residential definition. And then, again, the capacity for townhouses to have a larger scale and massing than the existing single-family houses in the area. Next slide, please. And if you are, if the Planning Commission does not make a recommendation to the City Council at this meeting, that will put you in a position that you would need to ask the City Council for an extension of your timeline. Oh, excuse me, yes. And there is, being as the request is inconsistent with the future land use map, that does automatically trigger an amendment to the future land use map if this case is approved. And so if and when you do make a motion, it should include a reference to a future land use map amendment if it is in the approval direction. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Madam Chair, you are muted.
Can you hear me now? You can hear me? Okay, good. I was unmuted here, but I think I was muted for the session. All right, so is there anyone who has questions for staff at this point? Please raise your hand. Mr. Thomasula.
Good morning. I just had this is more of a clarification question, but building on some of the, I guess, concerns of the neighboring development, I was just curious, I guess maybe from, I don't know if it's stormwater or from utilities, but would this being I guess whether it's a subdivision or an apartment complex, that the build out of it, will that, going through that process, help rectify some of that? And will the additional conditions of the 25-year help with the existing complications up there based off of improvements in infrastructure through the development process?
Yeah, so the nature of the city's stormwater regulations is that for certain types of storm events, the development must replicate the stormwater runoff after the development occurs. It must be equivalent to what was present before the development occurred. And so the normal code requirement is that in a 2-year or 10-year storm event, any runoff from the site can be no greater than the runoff that was there before that development went into the site. And then what the applicant has offered through their zoning conditions is to increase that to a 25-year storm event. And so that would mean that's the period of time when you can normally expect a storm of that magnitude to occur. So a 25-year storm would be a storm that size only happens once every 25 years in terms of the inches of rainfall that fall. And so with that particular stormwater standard, the nature of tying it to a storm event is that the benefits only become apparent when you reach that. So for a 2-year or 10-year storm, and that is in a 24-hour period, the amount of runoff, even if during that for a 2-year, 10-year storm, the amount of perceived runoff would be the same before and after, but the benefits of the 25-year storm capacity of the stormwater facility would only be felt if that storm occurs. So that 25-year storm facility is not going to make the runoff less for the 2-year and 10-year storm. And so I think the important thing that the Stormwater Division asked me to convey is that the typical storms that we see frequently are 2- and 10-year storms, your springtime rainy day. And so that offered condition won't impact those. Now, there is some possibility that simply adding drainage facilities to the site may direct the water in particular directions. And I believe, is there someone from Stormwater with us today? I invited Ashley. So they may be able to talk a little bit about the actual stormwater drainage directing water in particular directions, but that's unclear until the site is actually constructed.
Okay, thanks. I guess and which might be hard for you to answer. I didn't know. I know through a lot of development projects, a lot of the infrastructure off-site has to be improved based off capacity, load, and future projections, and just didn't know if, I guess it's hard to determine through whether it's site review or what process of review where they would have to, if making those improvements would actually help the neighboring development or not, based off of either stormwater or utilities department. But if that's too in the weeds, then we can just skip it.
Those requirements are more commonly applied to utilities, so water supply and wastewater, particularly wastewater. If the downstream capacity is not large enough to accommodate a development, then the developer will have to improve the capacity for the entire length to the trunk line or the main that runs along a stream. For stormwater, it really is highly dependent on whether the site is actually going to tie in to existing storm drains. In this case, that isn't clear at this point. There is a possibility that the applicant could drain towards the Thornton Road property and not have to tie into any existing storm drains.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Are there other questions for staff? All right, seeing none, I'm going to move on now to Adam Ashbaugh, who will present on behalf of the applicant. As a reminder, the applicant and those in support have 10 minutes to speak. The applicant can speak as long as he cares to, and then anybody that follows him that has time within the 10 minutes can speak up to 2 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning, Madam Chair and members of the Planning Commission. My name is Adam Ashbaugh. I'm both a certified planner as well as a registered engineer in the state of North Carolina, and I'm here today representing the applicant Terramore Homes. Representatives from Terramore Homes have also joined the call. Land Acquisition Manager Cameron Jones is on the call, and I believe Company President Pablo Ryder might also be on the call. We're each available at the conclusion of our brief presentation to answer any questions you may have. Before we get started, I really wanted to recognize and thank you for keeping business moving in these challenging and unusual times. We appreciate this opportunity to present you in a virtual format, and we look forward to your continued guidance as we move this request through the city process and seek your favorable recommendation to the City Council. As John noted in his presentation and staff report, and as we discussed in our first appearance before this commission on March 10th, this rezoning request is consistent with several policies outlined in the comprehensive plan. Those include the proposal of a conditional use district, compact development, a reinforcement of the urban pattern, density transitions, housing variety, and zoning for housing. As a reminder, when we last met, we discussed the feedback and concerns that we consistently heard from neighboring property owners in our neighborhood meetings and 2 CAC meetings, predominantly regarding density, the buffering of our project from existing homes, traffic impacts, and stormwater runoff. Rather than revisit our entire presentation from March, I wanted to focus on our proposed conditions, some of which have been updated based upon your feedback from the first meeting, including language updates we crafted that we included feedback from staff and the city attorney's office to make the condition language to be acceptable. This first slide, as you read the first and second conditions, they deal with the density, namely our offer to cap the density at 7.5 dwelling units per acre, which creates consistency with the density of surrounding subdivisions. As shown on the slide, the predominance of development in the area has been between 6 and 12 dwelling units per acre. Our proposed density cap is fairly consistent with the Addison Preserve Townhomes project just south of our site and is well below some of the more recent townhome development approvals. For example, the Thornton Creek Townhome development constructed in 2017. In addition, we've also offered regarding density conditions number 4 and 5 that restrict the allowable uses and product types. This proposed density offers an appropriate transition and buffer from the existing waste transfer station along Thornton Road to the single-family detached housing in both Castleberry and the park at Perry Creek to the south, while also providing for appropriate housing types and density adjacent to the future City of Raleigh parkland to the east. As you can see on the slide, this will create a similar transition of appropriate housing types and densities as to what exists between the Park at Perry Creek subdivision and the higher density uses along Capitol Boulevard. In our first meeting with your group, one commission member, I believe it was Michelle, expressed a concern about the impact on the proposed development from the existing industrial traffic on Thornton Road. And I want to assure you that the applicant is well aware of this existing business and shares your concern. If you could go to the next slide, please. Yes, we plan to address this concern in the form of buffering and setbacks from the Thornton Road right-of-way to the dwelling units. The width and opacity of this buffer will be addressed and shown on the site plan or preliminary plat to be submitted through the city review process should you or should the council approve this rezoning request. In addition, this slide and proposed condition number 7 provide for the buffering and fence requested along that edge by the Park at Perry Creek adjacent property owners. Next slide, if you would. So the Park at Perry Creek adjacent property owners expressed concern about not only buffering, but also construction traffic. Condition 7 originally included some language about the elimination and vacation of the existing driveway and the private access easement there. Although this language has been removed and revised at the request of the Raleigh Legal Department, the buffer and planting requirements, together with proposed condition number 3, restrict the point of access for construction traffic, should fully address the concerns of the Park at Perry Creek residents. The next slide, and proposed condition number 8. This addresses the buffering of the Castleberry subdivision from our proposed project. During the neighborhood and CAC meetings, the feedback we heard was that the majority of residents preferred an enhanced and widened buffer in lieu of a fence, given that some of these lots are situated below the grade of the proposed project, and folks didn't want to see a 6-foot-high retaining wall sitting above their existing retaining walls there, or a 6-foot-high fence above their retaining walls. So subsequent to the first Planning Commission meeting, John made us aware of an email request from one of these property owners who is now requesting that the fence option be reconsidered. So we reached out to this property owner and asked if she had a consensus amongst her group to avoid a hodgepodge placement of fence, no fence sections along that boundary. But to date, we have not seen a response from her. So this, along with the next slide, if you would, points out 2 options there, and wanted to let you know that Terramore is committed to providing what is best for both the residents along Boysenberry Lane, as well as the future residents of this proposed subdivision. And we've offered the language in the condition to provide either or both a fence and enhanced buffer there, depending on the preference of the Castleberry property owners. So next slide, condition number 9 addresses the concern about connection to Noose Forest Road. And this, if you recall, this was a condition that we talked quite a bit about in our March hearing. This now has been reworded to address the roadway connectivity. If you remember, we'd originally offered to eliminate a vehicular connection to this existing street stub and simply provide a pedestrian bike connection there based upon the desires of the adjacent property owners. However, if you remember, transportation planning staff deemed our original condition to be inconsistent with the city's comprehensive plan, and they assisted with the language of the condition you now see before you. Finally, on the next slide, as John mentioned in his presentation, the Castleberry residents have expressed problems with stormwater issues and the poor performance they're experiencing with their current drainage system. We have completed boundary and topographic surveys of the subject property. And as you can see from the image on the left, the existing drainage pattern has stormwater runoff that flows southeasterly towards the Castleberry subdivision. Mr. Tomasulo asked a good question about this issue. The image on the right of the slide demonstrates how our project drainage system will redirect this flow towards a future stormwater control measure, thereby creating a system that will function completely independently of the Castleberry system, including an outfall that will follow existing topographic patterns that will direct our treated runoff to the north, thereby completely bypassing and avoiding the Castleberry system. Although this project will have no impact on the Castleberry system and will in fact reduce runoff in that direction, we have nonetheless offered condition number 6 to provide an increased standard for design storm sizing, mar treatment, and attenuation system. John addressed this briefly earlier, and as a registered engineer, I just wanted to clarify a little bit of what this increased standard provides. First, the surface area of the stormwater management control system, as dictated by both the city and state stormwater regulations, is the major controlling factor in treating the first inch of runoff, which contains the majority of pollutants. As you probably understand, when it hasn't rained in a while, the first flush of rain contains the greatest amount of oils, dirt, grease, other pollutants, etc., which is routed through the stormwater system. And the sizing standards for treatment will most directly determine the overall size of the stormwater facility. The proposed condition of a 25-year storm event more directly addresses attenuation and volume of runoff from our site. Our condition basically will require an increased standard of reduced runoff from larger storm events and provide an enhanced control structure from our stormwater control device to attenuate the larger intensity rainfall from this type of storm event. With that, I'll defer to Cameron or any of the other folks at Terramore to see if they've got any additional information they'd like to share, and let you know again how much we appreciate the efforts of your commission and the City of Raleigh staff for keeping this matter moving forward in these challenging times. We'll be happy to answer any questions you may have regarding this proposal.
So you are out of time for your presentation. So at this time, we will just take questions from the commissioner for the applicant. Any questions? Please raise your hand if you have questions. Commissioner Winters, sorry. Please go ahead. I'm sorry, I can't tell if you're talking. Things are popped up over you and I don't hear you.
I'm sorry, I'm like double muted. Is this better?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay. Let me start over. Thank you for your for the presentation and going over everything. One thing that did strike me when you were talking about a resident that reached out to you that was for the fence, against the fence, and now for the fence. I have an email here from a Karma Williams. Does that sound like the name of the person?
No, the email we got, Cameron, you might have that information. I can look it up real quick, Miss Winters, if you'd like me to. But that was not from a Miss Williams. It was from another resident along that edge.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure that we have clarity about if this is approved, what that boundary would be, and if it was compatible for what the residents wanted. So if you could look that up, I'd appreciate that. Thank you.
Sure.
Other questions for the applicant, please raise your hand. I see scratching and hands up. Oh, there we go. Commissioner Hicks.
Sorry,
That's
I'm having
okay.
some technical issues today. I have a new setup. Just a point of clarification, I think, was the wording for the tree conservation areas cleaned up or adjusted? I think there was some questions about that to provide conditions that to improve rephrasing to allow secondary tree conservation areas to satisfy the B1 requirements. So I just maybe some clarification on how the tree conservation areas are being handled in this version.
Yeah, I will try. I'm sorry, this is Adam Ashbaugh. I'll try to address that, Ms. Hicks. Well, before I do that, though, I did look up the email. The email was from a Miss Quarry who had requested a fence. Now, again, that was contrary to what we heard in our CAC meetings. So we believe that our condition language offers both alternatives. And I want you to know that Terramore is willing to do both a fence and tree conservation area and buffer, whatever it takes. But again, their biggest concern is making sure that it's consistent along the entire frontage and not a hodgepodge of fence, no fence. We don't think that would look good for either our future residents or the existing residents there. So that's what we're trying to do, is just build a consensus of the property owners along that edge. And I do believe, to answer your question, Ms. Hicks, that the language, we worked with staff very closely to reword the conditions to make sure that we were addressing both buffer planting requirements, and if those areas qualify as tree conservation, to include those as both buffer, enhanced landscaping, and or tree conservation areas.
Does that answer your question, Commissioner Hicks?
Yes, I think so. Thank you.
Okay. Are there other questions for the applicant at this time? All right. At this point, I will bring it back to the table, so to speak, and for discussion amongst us. I do want to just explore for a minute before others jump in. The most recent email from Ms. Carmel Williams. It says, I apologize for sending this so late. I just saw a letter that was mailed. I never received a response back from my original email. Here are some pictures of cars parked at the end of Brambleberry Way where developers plan to open up. I'm still concerned about the increase of traffic in our neighborhood. Looking forward to discussion below. I don't know if she's joined us, but she sent us a longer email back in March about saying that a number of the residents in the Castleberry subdivision were very unhappy about this development. But that, of course, was before conditions changed. So I just wanted to get that on the record, since I think people are struggling to figure out how to get their voices heard in the new virtual world at this point, because they may not be reading their letters in time to understand how to get involved. I also want to note that back before the conditions were changed, that the North CAC voted against this 22-7, but a lot of revision has gone into the conditions since then that hopefully address some of those things. So is there anybody else who would like to say something about this case at this point? Please raise your hand. All right, Commissioner Lampton, I saw your hand first.
I just have can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I just have a question about, is there going to be a homeowners association associated with this particular project? And if so, would it be appropriate to have perhaps, number of cars per unit limitation? And then that might help. Because I think what I see in the pictures from Williams is, residents having more than one car that, they have to park on the street. So if there's a homeowners association that has some sort of conditions on how many cars per unit, that might be helpful.
Could the applicant speak to that?
Yeah, Ms. Lampman, this is Adam Ashbaugh. I will try to address that. There will be a homeowners association, most definitely. I'm not sure that we would have a specific restriction to number of vehicles that any resident could have. That's kind of hard to enforce, but we do have requirements for meeting both the city of Raleigh parking requirements for residents and their guests. And so based upon the number of bedrooms for each unit, there will be a specific number of parking spaces required within the development. Does that help?
That is helpful. What is the parking requirement again per unit? Might be.
Can someone from staff speak up for that?
Sorry, staff, thanks.
Is John still?
Sorry. Hi, this is, and of course, parking requirements are a topic of a text change that you have pending today. So it'll depend in part on your action, but the question was, what are the current parking requirements for townhouses? Correct. Okay. Second, I'm just, instead of doing it from memory, I am looking them up so I'm exact. So classified as multi-unit dwelling, you got one space per units with 0 to 1 bedrooms, plus one space for every 10 units for visitors. 2-bedroom units is 2 spaces, 3-bedroom units, 3 spaces, 4-bedroom units, 4 spaces, and each with those 1 space per 10 for visitors included. Of course, the text change that is in front of you today is proposing to lower those ratios, but that's what the code is now.
So would this applicant be grandfathered before, or are they going to be part of the text change?
It would depend on when the text change is submitted or is approved, but since I think the intention is for you to report it out today and it to be at public hearing as early as July 7th, assuming it gets approved on that sort of time frame, you would anticipate that site plan filed under here would, under the Permit Choice Act, have the choice of either following the current code or the revised code. It's unlikely they would have an approved plan in place, by July 7th. So I think it's likely that this development would be able to take advantage of the revised parking standards.
Other questions or thoughts at this time? Please raise your hand if you'd like to speak. I cannot see Matt Tomasulo. Oh, there you are. Sorry, I want to make sure I haven't missed you. All right. So I just want to note one more thing that I noticed in the case information, that the density and potential townhome development enabled by this proposal makes it inconsistent with the future land use map. The scale of the townhome buildings allowed by the requested zoning may be larger than the prevailing character of the area, leading to inconsistency with policies that call for scale and massing of new development to match existing development. The request is consistent with the comp plan, but it would be more consistent if the allowed density was reduced to 6 units per acre and townhouses were prohibited. Alternately, the request would gain policy consistency by reducing the maximum density and requiring significant open space within the site be set aside. So I have some concerns that about the consistencies or the inconsistencies here. I also feel some angst about not really having that much information about where the citizens sit with this zoning at this point. And so I'm having some qualms about being able to support this case at this time. So I'm looking to others to see what their thoughts are at this point. Does anyone want to share how they feel? Okay, Commissioner Hicks, I see your hand first.
Yes, I would like to see a little bit more information in the conditions to be more to become more compatible with infill compatibility and to address massing and height limits. I feel like, anyway, I'd like to see a little bit more on that. I'm a little concerned about that. And then also, I'd be interested to know from the applicant if they would be willing to provide some sort of open space condition as well to help it bring it more in consistency with the future land use map.
So can the applicant come back online and speak to the question about whether they're willing to provide additional conditions about open space?
Yes, I'm happy to do that. Again, this is Adam Ashbaugh. If the host can unmute Cameron Jones, I don't know if that's possible. I know he is on the call. He and I have been texting back and forth. Cameron, like I said earlier, he's a land acquisition manager with Terramore Homes. He could more directly address probably product type, height, and massing better than I would be able to. I can tell you that our, right now, again, this is just a rezoning, as you know, and we have done some preliminary concept plans and yield studies, and we are most definitely will exceed the minimum requirements for both tree conservation and open space areas, and those will obviously be reflected on the site plan when that's submitted to staff for review.
So can we unmute the other person? I'm asking the host because I can't do it, but I know
he's unmuted.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Very good. So most of these units will be 3-bedroom townhomes, so that lends itself to 3 base parking spots per unit plus the 1 per 10 per guest, assuming we are under the old, quote unquote, old guidelines. And this product, we actually were the builder of Thornton Creek, just up the street on Thornton Road about 2, maybe 3 years ago. And the market clearly received that product very well. We sold 96 townhomes in 1 year. So this is a product that the market and the area has welcomed with open arms, and something that we envision to be very similar to what you see at Thornton Creek. So they're two-story townhomes. Certainly nothing unusual regarding infill compatibility with heights, and we're not proposing to have three-story townhomes towering over single-family detached homes. Just trying to build a product that we built a year or two ago. The market really welcomed and was very well received.
Would you be willing to condition in the 2 stories?
I mean, if there's a true need to do that, then sure. Got no problem with that.
Are there other questions or comments that? All right, Commissioner Fox, please go ahead.
I think perhaps this might be a question for the engineer. Has there been any consideration that the stormwater control devices might be programmed to become open space amenities as well as just serving as pipe and pond function?
That's a good question, Ms. Fox. We have not gotten into full stormwater design, but typically, yes, we can create passive open space areas in and around the ponds, whether that becomes a wetland design system or trails around the backside of a dam, things of that nature. But yes, we always try to incorporate stormwater facilities into the design of the open space so that they become more of an enhanced feature for the neighborhood as opposed to just an eyesore that's tucked away in the back. So we always try to use them as attractive features, whether that be, again, the plantings and screening materials that we use, or creating a bioretention or wetland feature there. And again, some trails or things of that nature. So yeah, that is always one of the things that we incorporate into our design.
Any other thoughts from, Commissioner Fox, did you have another? Okay. Commissioner Winters, did I see your hand going up? Okay. It's hard to tell that people are touching things and I can't tell whether they're trying to unmute or about to raise their hands. Okay, so I don't see any other comments from Commissioner Tomasulo, please go ahead.
This is still on, I guess, on stormwater. I know that we had heard that stormwater staff was going to be evaluating different options to provide us that we might be able to present to applicants that can better handle, manage, and set us expectations for stormwater management, particularly in these like ETJ, more sensitive, like very close to heavy flood zone areas. If you turn on the floodway and flood zone on IMAPs, it's not on this property, but it is everywhere around it. And I'm sure that there's so much more water and runoff hitting this area from everywhere around it. And just, if just trying to, again, see what tools we might have to be better about development in these high pressure areas with regard to stormwater and flooding. I know I've said it before, but it's, we're seeing these areas because they're the lowest lying and they're the last to be developed for a reason. And I just would really like to see much heightened stormwater like some sort of setting expectations much higher. And I know that, staff says that we don't have those measures yet. I get it, but I think that it's to be passed along if we do move this forward to council, because these are opportunities that we're quickly losing.
So Mr. Tomasulo, are you asking for additional conditions for better stormwater management on this site, or are you talking in general for the city to provide more guidance to folks coming forward with these kinds of proposals?
I think a little bit of both. I think that I just don't think that the 25-year, from past that it sounds like, if my memory serves me correct, that is a classified level of storm that stormwater can handle, or can process. I know we've had some cases where there are not recognizable number of year storms, but I didn't know if staff had come up with any of those best practices or recommendations for ways that we can better mitigate and control through conditions, some of the stormwater conditions. So, I'm
sorry, I interrupted you. Do you want to finish your thought?
I was just going to say, because I see that they're going to be shifting, visually based off that diagram. It looks like they're going to be capturing all of their stormwater and treating it. So, is that something that they can properly, with the right terminology, condition?
Okay, so did we have somebody from Stormwater on the call? There was a question about that earlier. Is anyone from staff able to identify whether a Stormwater member is here?
Yes, this is Ashley Rogers.
Okay, thank you. Can you speak to what Mr. Tomasula was asking about with regards to some guidance that that the Stormwater Department was pondering putting together for guidance?
Yeah, I don't recall that specifically, honestly. What I will say is that our stormwater design manual, which lays out, it's part of code, it's incorporated into the UDO. So all requirements in the stormwater design manual are also code-based compliant requirements. That is currently under review right now. We're doing a rewrite, a big project, and I believe that the draft stormwater design manual should go out in the next couple of weeks. That is one opportunity for regulations in general, just speaking to the general comment, to be strengthened with respect to stormwater. So we've worked with a contractor and subcontractor to come up with what we think are best practices that should be implemented throughout the city. But then obviously there'll be an extensive process that will go through with a lot of public comment and ultimately, approved through council.
Will that come through Planning Commission? I'm sorry.
Yes, I believe that does. Yes.
All right. Thank you. So there's something in development, but Commissioner Tomasula, I believe you're asking for something maybe conditioned in as well to this case that might be more than a 25-year stormwater condition.
And I will say, I'm sorry, I was going to say, I will say that generally speaking, for this type of a concern, going to a larger design storm is the most appropriate way to do kind of above and beyond conditions for a project, because that's one of the things that we do regulate.
So you're saying going from a 25-year stormwater condition to something stronger, or I'm not sure I'm clear about that.
I'm just saying from a 10-year to a 25-year.
Okay.
So that's an appropriate above and beyond condition.
Okay. All right. So does that satisfy your concern, Commissioner Tomasula?
It gives me more information.
Okay.
Thank you.
Commissioner Miller, I saw your hand up.
Thank you. I wanted to first thank the applicant for adding these robust conditions. It sounds like I unfortunately did not get to attend that March meeting, but since then, it sounds like a number of the concerns that the neighbors had at that time have been addressed through a number of robust additional conditions. And I was wondering, did anyone sign up to speak in opposition since then, since the new conditions have been offered?
We did not have anyone listed for us today.
Gotcha.
Mr. Crane, can you speak to that? I believe that there was nobody that signed up to speak in opposition.
That is correct.
Right. And I believe we're having some trouble with people understanding the process at this point with the virtual meetings. I mean, it seems like we had several emails about several of these cases that said they got the paper email or the paper mail notice about something that was appearing before us late or sometime in the middle of the week last week. And then, sign up deadline was Friday. And, I don't know whether people just don't process their mail very quickly. But it seems like there's been a struggle to get people in the loop so they know to get on.
I don't believe we had opposition at the March meeting either. I don't believe.
At the March meeting, yes, I understand what you're saying.
Yep.
Okay, so Commissioner Fox, I believe I saw your hand up.
I want to follow up on some of the items Commissioner Tomasulo was speaking to. I do believe it is warranted to have additional stormwater conditions included in this, and not only speaking directly to the storm quantity, so a 20 versus a 25 year, but also considering low impact development, best management practices might be warranted for this particular site. And those might include recommendations of different types of stormwater features, permeable paving, rain gardens, things of that nature. So I did just want to follow up and say I do think that is warranted, and those types of elements can be included as amenities to speak to that element to make this project a little bit more consistent.
Commissioner Lampton, I see your hand.
I just have one other thought too, is that the greater conditions we put in terms of stormwater management, so let's say the number of acres that they have to devote to stormwater, that's going to create higher density if they're allowed, 6 or 7.5 units per acre. It's going to create essentially higher density on the other acreage of the entire lot. So something just to kind of keep in mind as we kind of help applicants and everybody understand what that will look like as we're putting pressure on one area than to appease another area. So just to think about that.
Any other comments from the commission members? All right, so it sounds to me that what we're asking the applicant for is some additional conditions to do with the height of the buildings and stormwater. I think those were the main two. And open space. So open space, stormwater, and keeping the units to 2 stories as conditions we would like to see before we vote on this case. So I'm putting this forward to the applicant as to whether he would be willing to go back and work on conditions that would make this case more palatable to us, or whether he'd prefer for us to vote today, because if we vote today, it sounds like we may not have some support for your case. So could the applicant come on and tell us your thoughts?
Yeah, I'd be willing to tell you what we would offer as conditions right now. First, we would condition that the units would be limited to 2 stories, as Cameron mentioned earlier. Second, with regard to the stormwater, if you recall the diagram that I had, the offer that we've already placed for a higher stormwater event, as Ms. Rogers pointed out, goes above and beyond the City of Raleigh Stormwater Design Manual. And it is a measurable design standard that we can calculate and do stormwater calculations for. So doing something different than that, I think, is difficult in terms of how to put that language into a condition. But what I would point out is that, as Mr. Tomasulo mentioned, a lot of developments, infill specifically, these days are on more lower lying lands. This property is not that case. This property sits on a bluff well above the 100-year flood from the Neuse River. And if it makes a little more clarity, the only area that would continue to drain towards the Castleberry subdivision to the south would be any tree buffer or tree conservation area that we would maintain and keep undeveloped along that property line. So I believe that the buffer language that we've included as a condition kind of addresses that a minimum 25-foot buffer is going to be offered there. So from a stormwater standpoint, again, Ms. Fox's comment about either permeable paving, those kinds of things, LID design, those are things that we contemplate with every single subdivision. However, because of where we are in the process, we are only at a rezoning stage. Those types of design criteria and analysis is really done at the time of platting or construction plan preparation. So I'm not sure, we have not, I would tell you, we have not done enough intense design of the site to be able to tell you what we could offer above and beyond the 25-year, 24-hour storm that we've offered. Ms. Lampton's comment about density, we completely understand, and the density that we're offering is not just on the developable area aside from open space and stormwater facilities. It is the entire property that the density will be based upon. So I don't know if that helps clarify, but I believe that the conditions that we've offered, together with the commitment to, if you would accept it as a condition now, to limit the building height to 2 stories. I could also offer that above and beyond the open space requirement, our open space requirement is 10% minimum tree conservation area, that we could increase that. Even though we have not done full engineering, I would feel comfortable committing that we would increase that to a 15% open space commitment. And that would include trees conservation areas, gathering spaces, things of that nature within the development.
Okay.
Can I just add, I just want to add one piece of clarification that the underlying property owners and sellers here, one of the property owners is Mr. and Miss Thornton, whom the road is named after. The other property owners are the Ricks, both of which have been in the area since the 60s, if not before then. They've owned this land before this land was developed into the other subdivisions. Now this has been their nest egg. Now that they're getting a little bit elderly and their kids are now getting to age and having grandchildren, these property owners are now at a position to where they want to sell their property. So understand that typically these parcels that are the last to develop can be the worst, but that's just not the case here. They've had their homestead for many years, and now they're at a position in their life where they want to sell their property for highest and best use, as anyone would, the same rights as we all have, and so with that becomes that the highest and best uses for a mixed intensity development. So we just want to be cognizant of the contract timeframe and their commitment to us as partners to get this project approved, and so would welcome a vote as long as we could add those conditions to the project today. Welcome a vote considering those added conditions today to keep this moving forward. Thank you.
So I'm going to let staff speak to why we typically don't vote if we still have conditions that have been offered but have not been written into the case yet. So if there's someone from staff who's willing to get on the line and tell us why we typically don't vote until we have all the conditions that we're expecting in the case and in our meeting.
Okay, so at this point, there's no time advantage for the applicant to having you move the case out today as opposed to 2 weeks from now, because they can't appear on a public hearing any earlier than July 7th regardless. So given that this is the last Tuesday in May and you have a second Tuesday meeting, there is still time for you to report it out at your next meeting with the opportunity to review the conditions. That means that the revised conditions are part of your vote and they go to the council, and the council can schedule the public hearing for July 7th. If you were to report it out today with a more generalized recommendation that the applicant make these changes that they've represented to you, you'd be voting on condition language, the specifics of which you have not seen, and the council would not be able to schedule the public hearing until a later meeting anyway, because they would have to receive those updated conditions, and they can't receive them between your action and it being reported out to them. So there simply is no difference in the time course for this zoning case, and therefore it's advisable for the Planning Commission to vote on the actual language, and it's much simpler for the council to deal with because all they have to do is set the date. They don't have to hold it for 2 weeks, wait for revised conditions to come in, and then set the date.
Thank you. So, Mr. Ashbaugh, at this time, do you agree to let us hold this for 2 weeks so that we can get
Thank you, Mr. Bowers, for clarifying that. I'm not sure we completely understood. As Cameron said, the underlying property owners have been frustrated through no fault of anybody's because of the the hardship that we're all faced with because of this pandemic. But yeah, I think, and I won't speak for Cameron, as he is the buyer and developer. So I'll let Cameron acknowledge, but I think that's probably fine.
Yeah, thank you for the explanation, Mr. Bowers. We were not aware of that, and so as such, have no issues with continuing to the next Planning Commission meeting.
Great, thank you.
Commissioner Lampton, you have one more thought before sending it along?
I do. I just didn't know if that fence and tree thing was addressed fully. I didn't know if that we wanted to.
Okay, so that's yet another thing that would be nice for the applicant to see if they can complete the loop on communication about the fence and the trees between the one resident in Canterbury, is that right?
Castleberry.
Castleberry, if you could try to close the loop on that communication, that would be most appreciated between now and then.
We will continue to reach out to Ms. Quarry. One thing that I would ask of John, if he could, is to forward any comments that you received from adjacent property owners. We had not seen anything else. Somebody on the conversation today mentioned an email from a Mrs. Williams. So I have not seen that. The only correspondence that we got forwarded from John was that from Mrs. Quarry. So yes, we're absolutely happy to reach out to the entire group along that roadway.
That would be most appreciated.
Consistency of their request. Yeah, understand and collaborate with them.
Great.
I just want to ask to the trees in itself, that would also help with some of the water issues as well, right? It would create, if we can double up on the help of having the trees there and it helps address some of the other issues, I just think that should be considered.
Yeah, good question, Ms. Lampton. One way that we might tweak the storm drainage condition is that, again, clearly we would not do anything to disrupt or disturb the existing tree cover within that 25-foot buffer that abuts the Castleberry subdivision. So the goal would be to intercept any drainage before it got to that buffer and route it to our stormwater facilities. And so we'll look at ways that we might be able to enhance our 25-year committed stormwater condition and include something that, again, captures all of the runoff within our subdivision, short of obviously having to disturb tree conservation area and buffer and undisturbed natural buffer vegetation that we would want to maintain there.
Thank you for taking those on. So at this time, we'll table this case for 2 weeks and pick it back up and look for the conditions and closing the loop on the communications. Thank you for appearing with us. Oh, Mr. York has a thought.
Yeah, you still have the timing issue. The deadline for reporting this out is June 8th, and your June meeting will be the 9th.
Oh, I thought I heard Mr. Bauer say that we were actually going to make it the deadline. So, so we do need to request a time extension at the next city council member or meeting. So,
my apologies, I had not
paid
attention to that part of the timing. I've been looking at the scheduling of the public hearing. But
okay, so so we need to request do we need to vote to request a time extension? Okay, so Could someone make a motion, please, to request a time extension for this case to give the applicant time to respond with additional conditions? Commissioner Hicks?
I move for a time extension for additional conditions. I'm not sure how long of a time extension we need. 2 weeks?
I would say 30 days. Just
30 days.
Yeah.
30 days.
I'll second it. And now, Chinitha, would you like to make a roll call for this vote, please?
I have a question.
Was that Commissioner Miller?
Oh, sorry. I'm good. My just having some technical issues. I'm good.
Okay. Chinitha, are you there?
Commissioner Bennett, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Fox?
Aye.
Commissioner Hicks?
Mr. Hicks?
Didn't hear you.
Sorry, aye.
All right. Chair Jeffries?
Aye.
Chair Commissioner Lampman?
Aye.
Commissioner Mann?
Aye.
Commissioner McIntosh?
Aye.
Commissioner Miller?
Aye.
Commissioner Tomasula?
Aye.
And Commissioner Winters?
Commissioner Winters? We didn't hear you. You have to say aye, I think.
I'm sorry, I have two mutes on. Aye.
Okay, thank you. We do need the voice, right? Is that why we're doing this?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
That's correct.
All right. So the motion passes unanimously. Moving on. Item C2, case number CP8.
Chairman.
I'm sorry.
Jeffries, sorry to interrupt. And I apologize, this is out of order, but when I was fussing with technical things at the beginning, I wanted to circle back around to one item on the consent agenda. I received an email from Michael Birch for case Z5119, and he had requested that it be placed on the June 9th Planning Commission meeting agenda. And I just wanted to bring that to your attention and the commission's attention.
Thank you, Ms. Hicks.
I apologize for being out of order.
It's okay. I'm glad you spoke up. I assume that staff will work to list that as one of the options for that particular meeting. So moving on, we are at CP 818 Rogers Farm on the north side of Newbern Avenue, east and west of North Rogers Lane. This is the request to amend the comprehensive plan in the area of North Newbern Avenue and North Rogers Lane. This request was last discussed at the May 12th meeting. The commission had questions about the requested future land use designation and future street network. Mr. Anagnost will speak to us.
Good morning again. This is CP-8-18, a set of proposed comprehensive plan amendments in the area on the north side of Newbern Avenue around North Rogers Lane. There are three types of amendments here: a future land use map, street plan map, and the planned interchanges and grade separations map. Next slide, please. You're probably familiar with the area from the last meeting, so I won't go into a lot of detail, but this is a remaining portion, undeveloped portion of the Rogers Farm PD, which was approved a little over 20 years ago, and the applicant has also submitted an application to rezone this same area that they're proposing these amendments for. Next slide, please. So the first amendment is to the future land use map, and the current designation is moderate density residential. The proposed designation is community mixed use, and so that would encourage, the proposed designation would encourage commercial uses, office uses, and many forms of residential. as well as mixed-use developments that may include any of those land uses. And we can skip to slide number 8, the first slide with the policy analysis. And so this request was evaluated as inconsistent overall with the comprehensive plan. Next slide, please. Largely due to the continuation of a strip pattern of commercial development on New Bern Avenue east of I-440, and also the potential for there to be large-scale or even regional-scale retail in this location where it is directly adjacent to residential development. And so the next slide shows an alternate proposal submitted by the applicant. And so this would designate a portion of the site as office and residential mixed use on the north central portion of the site in between the main body of the site and the existing townhouse development to the north. And so subsequent policy evaluation of this alternate proposal is that it is consistent with the comprehensive plan because it does resolve the issues of having intense commercial uses or light industrial uses adjacent to residential areas. And that would provide a proper buffer district between commercial uses and residential. And next slide, please. So you can just see which of those policies moved. So the struck-through policies on this page were the underlined policies on the previous page. Next slide, please. So the second portion of this request is a set of amendments proposed for the street plan map. And so basically in this area, North Rogers Lane is constructed and serves as the north-south conduit. There is dedicated right-of-way for an extension of South Hall Drive that would pass through this area. And so the applicant is proposing to basically have South Hall become North Rogers Lane as opposed to continuing through this area and past New Bern Avenue. And if we go to the next slide, we can see that a little bit closer. And so you can see here the right-of-way for South Hall Road is dedicated currently. And so this would entail some abandonment of public right-of-way if this is approved. But what it would do is, in the future, the street plan map proposes that South Hall Road be the main artery through here and that North Rogers would tee into South Hall. And what the applicant is proposing is that North Rogers become the main artery and that a new street coming north from New Bern Avenue tee into North Rogers Lane. Next slide, please. And so here you can see the larger area, and that enables you to see how those two streets come back together on the south side of New Bern Avenue, and that eventually becoming North Rogers Lane, and that passes south to South New Hope Road. Next slide, please. Here is an aerial showing the constructed North Rogers Lane and the dedicated South Hall Road extension. So you can see that South Hall has not been constructed but has been dedicated. And there was a question at the last meeting about the existing townhouse neighborhood and what was anticipated in terms of street connectivity when that neighborhood was approved and constructed. And so the next slide shows an excerpt from the approved subdivision plan from that neighborhood. And so when that was approved in 1995, the current driveway that accesses that neighborhood from North Rogers Lane was meant to be temporary, and that when South Hall Road extension was built, that driveway would be closed and that would be replaced with an extension of one of the other drives within that neighborhood. And to remind you, the streets in that townhouse development are private, but there was intent, according to the approved subdivision, to extend another drive to the South Hall Road extension. And so the initial subdivision approval was that street to the south on this image, and then there was an amendment to the subdivision that was also approved that changed that to the drive kind of midway between the currently built drive and the previously proposed drive on the south end. Next slide, please. And this gives you a little bit more indication of what that looks like in the real world today. So you can see that built drive was intended to be closed. Next slide, please. So this request was evaluated as consistent with the comprehensive plan due to the similar level of street capacity that would be afforded with the existing street plan proposed streets and the applicant's proposed amendment to the street plan, and that the traffic study provided by the applicant showed sufficient level of service that the street network that they're proposing would be functional in the horizon year 2045. Next slide. And next slide, please. The final amendment in this package of amendments is to remove a proposed grade separation at the South Hall Road extension. And so the nature of that grade separation, next slide, please, is that it would facilitate uninterrupted travel north and south along South Hall Road, and that if people wanted to make turns to and from New Bern Avenue, they would be able to do that using North Rogers Lane as essentially as the ramps of what would be a large intersection or interchange. And so because of the introduction of I-87 as a bypass for US 64 or US 264, that grade separation is no longer warranted based on the expected traffic counts out to the year 2045, and that the amount of traffic that's forecasted would be well below what would warrant a grade separation. And so next slide. This request is also evaluated as consistent with the comprehensive plan due to the adequate level of service that would be provided in the future. And I can answer any questions that you might have.
Any questions for staff? Looking and waiting for my squares. Okay, there we go. Commissioner McIntosh.
Yes, so in the staff report update for today, there's a note at the end that says the request remains inconsistent with policies that discourage strip retail development and automobile-oriented development patterns. And I know we've seen the plans for the proposed rezoning that's going to occur after this comprehensive plan amendment. And I know they did offer the new use designation of the mix of office and residential partially to alleviate that concern. But I still have a concern about this plan amendment being approved ahead of rezoning. In the event that rezoning didn't end up being proposed and something else went in, I think I'd like an assurance, if we're approving this comp plan amendment ahead of rezoning, I'd like an assurance that it's actually going to be mixed use and not going to be a strip development. And so is there some sort of condition that could be added to assure that development here will be mixed use rather than strip development?
Could staff speak to whether we can have such a condition on a CP?
I don't believe you can. You can't write site-specific conditions into the comprehensive plan, and this is a comprehensive plan amendment. I mean, the way that that's typically done is that there's a detailed area plan that might contain some guidance, but again, you have to review it in the context of a rezoning. Like the plan language won't have an impact until there's a rezoning. If there's no rezoning, then they're able to develop the land consistent with what it's currently zoned for. The major change here is what street pattern they would be required to construct under development with or without a rezoning. The land use designation change doesn't change any land uses that are permitted today. It would have an influence on how a rezoning to permit different land uses would be reviewed. Without conditions, even the UDO, which generally, has favorable treatment for mixed-use development, does not mandate that you provide it. A CX district could be developed with both a multi-story mixed-use building. It can also be developed with a one-story strip mall. Those are both permitted uses within a CX district. So I'm not sure there's absent putting area-specific guidance in the plan, which I think is a step well beyond what the applicant is proposing. I can't think of a way where a condition like that could be added to this matter.
May I add to that answer a little bit?
Sure.
I think actually, Ken, you got at this question during the last meeting when you said that potentially amendments to the urban form map could be petitioned by the applicant. And that isn't legally binding, but adding urban form designations in the form of a mixed-use center or some corridor designation on one of the streets in this area would signal to future planning commissions and city councils that the desire here is not for a vehicle-centric style of development.
Okay, that is correct. Now, putting a mixed-use designation on the urban form map, I think, is helpful in terms of reviewing a future application. Still not a complete guarantee that a future application would guarantee mixed-use development. Still doesn't change the existing zoning. One of the things it does do is it provides a little more specification as to what the frontage approach would be on the new streets that are being designated. So, for example, as part of an urban form map amendment, one of these streets could be designated as a main street. That seemed to be consistent with the concept plan we saw earlier, and that would definitely be a factor in reviewing a rezoning proposal, because there would be a desire to see an urban approach to frontage along that street.
Commissioner Fox, do you have a thought?
I have a question for staff. I apologize putting you on the spot. I don't know if this is for, well, I guess I don't really apologize, Ken. Question, if just for comparison's sake, can someone tell us what the future land use designation is in the vicinity of Cameron Village? I can't hear you.
I think folks are looking.
Yeah. I'm looking it up, but from memory, I believe the shopping center itself and maybe some parcels around it are developed community mixed use.
So not too far different from what this request is.
Commissioner Mack, oh wait, let's answer that question first. So is that true? Not too different?
Yes, it is designated for community mixed use in the Cameron Village Shopping Center itself.
Okay.
And the perimeters, John, I think is a mix of office residential mixed use and residential mixed use. I'm sorry, with the video chat, my iMaps is slow to load.
Yes, the edges are a mixture of office and residential mixed use, a small amount of neighborhood mixed use, and then on the east side towards Broughton High School, high density residential.
Thank you.
Commissioner McIntosh.
Well, my understanding is the existing New Bern is also community mixed use, and that is strip development. I guess I'd also ask, what is the designation along Capitol Boulevard, which is also nearby?
There's lots of designations on Capitol, but you'll find some community mixed use up there as well, including some regional mixed use up in the Triangle Town Center area, as well as some business and commercial services in some of the more flex and industrial areas.
I have a question about the urban form map as being a potential use here, though it's guidance and not binding. What would be the process for that? Would the applicant have to come forward with that as an amendment to this case, or would it be separate, or how it, in fact, could that be leveraged at this point to at least provide some, maybe some level of comfort that that's their intention?
Well, I mean, I think the easiest way to do it would be to amend the case that's in front of you to include that. Therefore, when you'd be voting on it all at once. Assuming that your comfort level with the change is dependent on that, then you would want to hold this even if it were a separate comp plan amendment. But there's no reason why their current application couldn't be amended to include it.
Okay, so it's possible to do it that way. Commissioner McIntosh, would having that extra level of guidance be of comfort with your concern?
think so. I apologize. I'm not sure I totally understood I'm not sure could that be repeated?
Yeah, could someone please explain it again?
So the current request is to amend the comp plan, and it's amending the future land use map, and it's amending the Raleigh Street plan. This would simply be amending the comp plan amendment to also include an amendment to the urban form map. And if the applicant was so willing to go that route, the easiest way to do it would be to simply amend this application, because then you would be voting on it all at once. You would see it as a package, as opposed to bringing a separate comp plan amendment application in.
Yeah,
So
yes.
They would amend their urban form map to specifically say what?
Well, I think we would want to work with the applicant, but designating a mixed-use center designation on this general area and the precise boundaries to sort of be determined, but basically the area that's subject to the future land use map amendment. And then on one or more corridors, designating one of probably a main street category or maybe an urban thoroughfare category, something that speaks to what frontage approach would be used when developing along that street. So, a different street pattern is proposed here. There's a sort of central spine street, which is actually not part of the street plan amendment today. Question is, should that be added? If not, and if it is, could that be designated a main street? Is there some other option? I'm not prepared to say exactly what it would be. We'd have to probably do some work with the applicant. I think some general guidance from what type of urban design outcome you're looking to see would be helpful. So if what you're mainly looking is that this be more affirmative statement that mixed use is the goal here, and that at least for one or more of the streets that would be internal to this development, that a pedestrian oriented urban approach to frontage is also desired. Those things could be accomplished on the urban form map.
Commissioner McIntosh, does that help?
Yeah, yes, it does. And it sounds like it would be making it one of the blue dots on the urban form map. And then also, I think along with that, it might make sense to incorporate the comments from Jason Brown, Assistant Development Services Director of Knightdale, talking about connectivity with Knightdale, especially across the Neuse River.
Yeah, and essentially, if you look at the urban form map, you see that where there are blue dots, typically there are corridor designations on certain streets within those areas. So those are typically found together in the urban form map. In fact, they're found together already on the urban form map on New Bern Avenue in the vicinity of New Hope.
So is the applicant, Mr. Mills, Worth Mills, on the phone with us?
Yes, good morning. This is Worth Mills. Good morning, Madam Chair and members of the Planning Commission. I can jump in and give, we haven't looked at the urban form map designation very seriously because we thought that after the May 12th meeting that our primary objective was to add some differing future land use areas to buffer from the townhomes. I do have a couple of opinions though about.
Let me interrupt you for just a second, please.
Oh, absolutely. Sorry.
Just to be clear, we did hear from you last time, so this is not the regular 10 minutes for an applicant to speak. This is you answering our questions, so we don't really need the timer for that. If I'm incorrect, please correct me. So we'll remove the 10-minute timer. So we're just looking for you to respond to what has happened today, and I'll let you continue from there. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to have to interrupt.
Oh, no worries, and thank you for that clarification. And so right now, New Bern Avenue in front of this property is designated as a parkway corridor. The main street designation on New Bern ends right at the intersection of Raleigh Beach Road and New Bern Avenue to the east. And so I think if we were to revise the urban form map, I think that's going to open us up to a whole lot of other questions about how does the rest of New Bern Avenue, how is that designated? Does it remain Parkway? Does that change? And so I think there's a lot of questions there. To Ms. McIntosh's concerns about specificity within the development, I think one of the things that our case has going for it is that it's a master plan as opposed to a conditional rezoning case. And so we have the ability to offer a lot more specificity as to where certain land uses will be located, how intense those land uses will be. We have included standards in there that as they relate to pedestrian connectivity. And so I think given that, there's a master plan following the comprehensive plan amendment, there will be a lot more specificity than you would otherwise see in a conditional use rezoning case. So while, from a high level standpoint, the urban form map may provide some guidance that's in line with discouraging strip development, the most concrete evidence that we can give is just in the master plan itself. And I think that we've created a plan that is not strip development and that folks from around the neighborhood would be able to access via bike or by foot or car if they wanted to. But I think the best avenue for that specificity lies within the master plan itself rather than maybe trying to alter the urban form map, which could create issues along New Bern Avenue for other property owners. So those are my 2 cents. Of course, we're willing to work with Planning Commission, but I think that the master plan would address those comments and those concerns better than an urban form map change would.
Commissioner McIntosh, I see you're ready.
Yes, I think this goes back to the issue that Commissioner Tomasulo raised at the beginning of our discussion on this case at our last meeting, and that is that we are considering approving a comp plan change before we consider the master plan that he's speaking about. And so we're not voting on the master plan today. We're voting on a comp plan amendment that is separate from that master plan. And that's why I don't feel comfortable with the language when this is presented to us as one statement that was made in the first presentation is that by changing this to mixed use, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the exact designation, but they're changing it to the same use as the rest of New Bern. And they were saying now it's going to be just like the rest of New Bern. And I appreciate that it's consistent on the map, but the truth is I personally don't want to replicate the strip development that's currently on New Bern. And that's the root of my concern. And I think it goes back to Mr. Tomasulo's original concern of the order of operations we're using as we look at these plan amendments and zoning cases.
Chair, could I respond to Ms. McIntosh and just kind of give some context as to why the timing was the way it was?
I think you can, but I think concern is a general one, not just specific to this case, is that we're seeing these come in separate. But this one is also causing concern because it's like you want a comprehensive plan amendment based on certain things that we can't verify.
Understood.
Yeah, and so I'm not sure, and a lengthy explanation of why that's happened is useful at this time. I don't know if anybody else feels like they need an explanation about it in this particular case. Anybody? Ms. Lampman, and I apologize, Ms. Lampman, for
that's okay.
Messing up your name so many times today. I know it's not Lampton. I know it's Lampman, but I, for some reason, cannot get that to come out of my mouth correctly every time.
That's quite all right. The only, I think along those lines too, I think if we had, a rezoning at the same time of the development being proposed, that's one thing. So for example, like in terms of the roadway, I'm fine with the roadway changes. And so, I mean, this is kind of holding up an overall process, and I just don't know why it needs to be in this way in particular? I mean, how can we make this better for everybody?
So it seems to me that we may want to take that, make it better for everyone offline and take that up if we ever get one in another meeting venue like the strategic planning venue. I'm not sure that whether that's the most appropriate place. Maybe staff can speak to that. Mr. Bowers, do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, at this point, you have no committee meeting scheduled, so.
I know. So are you thinking maybe we should take this up in a regular planning commission meeting as something for discussion about making a recommendation for something the city council to take up as to what, guidance for bringing together cases that are coming to us so separate, trying to get them back together again? I'm not sure how to address this concern, this general concern in this one case right now. We cannot address it in this one case, so we need to make a decision about this case, probably, without thinking about the zoning.
Okay, so applicants are entitled to bring forth a comp plan amendment, and they're entitled to bring forth a rezoning case, and they're entitled to bring the zoning case forward without a comp plan amendment, or they can decide that they want to submit one of their own volition. The one thing that the city cannot do is require that a comp plan amendment accompany a rezoning case.
Okay.
Because that's spelled out currently in state law.
Okay.
So as long as that remains, is that changing, by the way, in 168, Mr. York?
I don't think specifically, no.
Okay, thank you. So I don't think we're in a position to have a policy in place that runs afoul of that. So we'd have to at least be aware of that in terms of thinking about how to address this going forward. At the staff level, our approach has been that we look at the merits of the case in isolation as to what's in front of you, which I think is what the commission has been doing. This is a specific request that moves some streets around on the street plan and changes a land use designation, and that's it. That's all that they're currently requesting, and that's the decision as to whether these land use designations and these streets are better for the public interest than what's on the map today. There are representations about what they intend to do future in terms of bringing forth a new PD master plan for the area, which is great, but is not necessarily germane to the decision that's in front of you, because these designations are just policy designations that have certain implications, but they don't guarantee certain outcomes that you may be interested in. And so it's certainly legitimate to have the discussion that you're having. If the applicant is, for whatever reason, is unwilling to make an urban form map change or do other designations, then you have to decide whether, given what's in front of you, you're comfortable with the change or not. I guess at this point, I'm not sure, without giving us some more thought, that I see room for us to adopt a specific policy on this issue. What I think is more important is just consistency in terms of how the Planning Commission as a body deliberates on these, and I guess the staff perspective, the way to deliberate them on is to consider the merits of the thing that's in front of you without consideration of hypothetical things that might follow on from it that you can't be assured of.
Right. So, Commissioner Miller.
I just wanted to thank you for providing that insight. It is a challenging piece right now to try and figure out what the future of this is, what this actually means for this area in this process. And so we really, if this is the process that we currently have in front of us, then looking at it piecemeal and looking at each piece discretely, looking at this specific proposed comprehensive plan amendment. I know we discussed this at length on May 12th as well. And, changing it from moderate density residential to community mixed use residential. If you look at the surrounding area, it is characterized by heavy commercial and industrial and light industrial uses all around this area, especially and with very with minimal housing. And so the fact that, and including and we're trying to make a transition into the housing development. And I know in the comprehensive plans, one of the policies specifically is to try and create that kind of density transition between the lower density neighborhoods and the more intensive commercial uses. And community mixed use is actually the designation immediately to the west of this as we move into the more residential areas. So, if this is all that this discrete question is asking with respect to this comprehensive plan amendment, whether this specific area all along and surrounded by heavy commercial and light industrial uses would be appropriate for community mixed use. The staff report indicates that this is compatible with the surrounding area and it promotes the appropriate development of the mixed use activity centers. And for the residential developments around this area, it works towards promoting reducing the vehicle miles traveled through the mixed use in this area. And I think that it really serves as a nice transition conceptually between these two areas. Then obviously in the future, we're going to see a master plan and have additional authority at that time to review and propose additional conditions before that can move forward. And so I just wanted to say, given the nature of this specific area and the difficulty in getting, with the fact that it's along a parkway corridor without access to or planned significant multimodal transportation in this area, I think that this as a discrete project, as a discrete comprehensive plan amendment does make sense. And but I would be very interested in the future on looking at the master plan and making sure that we keep all of this in mind when we review all of those issues. But I think as a deliberative body, we have been pretty good, obviously, at looking at that and making robust analysis and decisions. I was looking back on my notes from the May 12th meeting. It looks like this went to 3 CAC meetings and had a fairly ambivalent response even at some of the bigger meetings, mainly because a lot of folks from the Northeast CAC don't live near this area. So, even more pointing to the fact that we need this kind of transition area for this specific question with respect to the comprehensive plan amendment. I'm in favor of that.
Commissioner McIntosh.
I would just like to point out that the mixed-use center up the street at New Hope, that I think is also on the, the blue dot map.
Yes, the urban form map, yes.
As a mixed-use center, is currently a Walmart, and across the street is a Walgreens. And while these serve the community well, I don't think any of us would consider them at a first glance as mixed use. And I'm just trying to point out that this designation does not guarantee a walkable mixed use development. And that's why I'm concerned about the order of operations here.
Right. So just, obviously the urban form map designation in that particular area is somewhat aspirational and speaks to future redevelopment of what is currently a fairly suburban retail approach. The development there was already largely in place by the time the map was adopted.
Okay, I'd like to bring us Commissioner Winters. You're muted. Sorry, you're muted.
But, and that's a really great point that you brought up, because I was also thinking about the comment of wanting New Bern Avenue to be consistent. If you look even further up the street, there's also the other strips that were I think it's the Carly C's, that kind of thing, that's even across the street from the Walmart that's considered mixed use in that area as well. So I echo your point, Commissioner McIntosh, about what that would look like in an area that's already has a high concentration of that up the street, as well as if you look at across the 540 corridor with those areas as well. So what does that mean for this area that is highly residential for that community? And that is a concern.
Okay, with that, since I don't see anybody eager to make another comment yet, I'd like to try to bring this in because we're closing in on 11 o'clock and we have two, probably long cases before us because I anticipate a lot of discussion. So I'd like for us to come to a conclusion about this case. Are we going to make a motion today, or are we going to ask the applicant to go back and consider the urban form map? What is your pleasure, Commissioner Fox? You're muted.
I'm unmuted on my side. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay. I just wanted to show my support for what Commissioner Miller had been saying. If we do think about this in isolation, the underlying land use component of it is similar, and that's what we would use to achieve walkable mixed use areas. Now, whether or not we get that with the development plan is what the review process for the master plan is for. And so I would be willing to move forward with the comprehensive plan amendments at this point, and then take careful consideration of what the master plan looks like.
Are you making a motion? You've gone silent again.
I think it's because Ray doesn't like me.
So are you making a motion?
So moved.
All right. So I believe you're going to have to provide us some motion should cite comprehensive plan consistency and include a statement as to why the request is reasonable in the public interest.
I make a motion to approve the comprehensive plan amendments associated with the future land use map and associated maps related to transportation. I do believe that they are consistent with the comprehensive plan and in the public interest, in that they do provide a path forward to achieve a node and a mixed use development along this corridor, which will serve as a gateway to Knightdale and also be served by transit in the future.
Do we have a second?
Second.
I didn't see who was first, but I think it was Commissioner Lampman. So I'll write you down as Commissioner Lampman. All right, and at this time, I will turn it over to Janitha for a roll call for the members to record their individual votes.
Commissioner Bennett, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Fox?
Aye.
Commissioner Hicks?
Aye.
Chair Jeffries?
Aye.
Commissioner Lampman?
Aye.
Commissioner Mann?
Aye.
Commissioner McIntosh?
Nay.
Commissioner Miller?
Aye.
Commissioner Tomasillo?
Aye.
And Commissioner Winters?
Nay.
Okay, I have recorded that the motion passes by a vote of 8-2. Is that correct, Janitha? Was that a yes?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. Moving on. So I had gotten script from Mr. Crane that puts the next case as TC 120, which is for the parking for multi-unit residential development citywide, as to come before TC 1619. Was there a reason for that, Mr. Crane?
No, ma'am, that's entirely in your discretion as a body. It's likely that the script was in production before the agenda was published.
Okay. All right. I would like to go ahead and take up TC 1-20 prior to TC 16-19, because I think we're going to have extensive conversation on TC 1619, and I'd like to save that to the end. I may be wrong, and TC 120 may also elicit that kind of conversation, but let's go forward with that, please.
I'll just say, I think what is do we have to vote on both of these today? I see that the recommendation deadline is June 10th. Is that right?
The City Council has requested that we vote on these today to move them along. So they only gave us 30 days to act on them.
Gotcha.
So
the next
doesn't mean we
recommendation
have
deadline
to.
is the 10th. Is that right?
Yes.
What will happen if you do not vote on it is that it'll pass out of Planning Commission without a recommendation to appear on the City Council, the second meeting in June.
So if the deadline is June 10th, the next Planning Commission meeting is June 9th. Is that right? For both of these text changes.
Oh,
That sounds right.
okay. Yes, you're correct. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. Okay. So I had been told we had to vote on them today, but I'm gathering that we don't have to vote on them today. Thank you for pointing out the timing. So
I just wanted, that was what we went over last time, is that we thought we'd have to vote on it today. So I just wanted to clarify that when I saw the new.
Thank you for doing that.
Sure.
I've only been looking at June 6th since that's my retirement date from the commission. So I haven't thought much about past that at this point. So I apologize for not catching that earlier. So we can choose to have a significant conversation about both of these today and not vote today, and choose instead to vote on the 11th. No, sorry, the 9th. So, all right. Well, let's go forward with TC 1-20.
Good afternoon, Keegan McDonald, Planning and Development. So I will be going over TC-120. So this is a three-part text change, and I've kind of broken it down into those three constituent parts. So the first section is related to parking requirements. So just a general overview of the proposed changes. These are discussions that were born out of the former Healthy Neighborhoods Committee of the City Council, and were authorized on January 7th. So the first portion would be to eliminate all parking requirements in the DX district, and this is minimum requirements. The second would be to eliminate residential parking requirements in the TOD district. Again, those are minimums. And the third portion would be to reduce minimum parking requirements for multi-unit living citywide, as Ken had hinted at earlier on one of the zoning requests. Next slide, please. Just a little bit of background about parking requirements for those that may be unfamiliar. They are somewhat empirically grounded, but they are, it's a little bit fickle in terms of determining the exact demand for a particular use, but we assign each use a specific parking requirement, and they were addressed really over concerns of spillover parking, especially in the downtown area, where there was thought of excess cars filling up the streets and potentially adjoining neighborhoods. And it's important to note that they also involve assumptions about the future of transportation. And we are now kind of looking towards how those transportation habits and patterns might change. For instance, will there be a greater emphasis, especially in the downtown and TOD areas, with on transit and walking? Will ride sharing take a larger proportion of mode share generally, also micromobility, et cetera? And so it spurred a conversation to rethink minimum parking requirements, especially in the DX. Next slide, please. And there's a thought too that minimum requirements can often conflict with a lot of other goals that the city may have to produce livable, sustainable environments. They can impact affordability of development by requiring for additional parking to be provided. They also act as kind of an incentive for people to drive, and can be seen as a subsidy for drivers, and potentially a detriment to people who choose to other modes of transportation, whether it be walking, biking, or transit. And there's also added environmental concerns as well in terms of reduction in stormwater runoff we would like to see, and additional, especially surface parking, can lead to an increase in that. Next slide, please. So part of this analysis was to look at peer cities. And as you can see here, this is an overview of downtown parking requirements for some cities within the region, also those of either a similar size or similar growth pattern, and similar transit offerings. Particularly Richmond is a good example And as you can see, a number of these cities have eliminated minimum parking requirements in the downtown. And even Raleigh, when compared to Charlotte, seems to have a higher number of minimum required spaces. Next slide, please. So currently, the non-residential requirement in the DX district is 1 space per 500 square feet of floor area, no spaces for the first 10,000 square feet, and that exemption can actually go up all the way to the first 30,000 square feet when at least 25% of the ground floor of the building is dedicated to select commercial uses such as restaurant or retail. And there's also additional exemptions for movie theaters and hotels. The residential requirement is 1 space per dwelling unit, and there is an exemption for kind of smaller residential buildings, no spaces for the first 16 units. So the proposed changes would eliminate the minimum required parking in the downtown mixed-use district, and it would also set a cap on the number of spaces provided for residential, and that would be 2 spaces per dwelling unit for residential uses. So again, eliminating the requirement generally and setting a cap just for residential uses at 2 spaces per unit. Next slide, please. So one of the concerns that was raised, especially during the committee conversations, was about parking spillover, kind of the initial concern in instituting these in the first place, and also got brought up later on. So this is the idea, again, that a particular site or use may be using more than its fair share of street parking, hence the desire to potentially provide off-street parking on site. There was thought that setting a minimum is kind of a blunt tool. Of course, developers can choose to provide parking if they think it's absolutely necessary, but setting a minimum might not be the best approach. And one tool that's been used since 1979 is residential permit parking areas to address this, especially in those residential areas where it's of particular concern. So there are 11 of these areas. There's a pretty defined process for petitioning the city council and also the transportation department to review and potentially recommend approval of a new permit area. This would, comes with a $20 annual fee for the residents, tenants, or property owners, and is thought to pretty adequately address those concerns in those specific areas, and also shifts some of the cost of parking onto those who actually drive or need the spaces, as opposed to all residents or tenants within a specific area. Next slide, please. So within the TOD, currently the parking requirements are actually very similar to the DX. So the requirement is 1 space per 500 square feet, no spaces for the first 10,000 square feet of a mixed-use building that meets the transparency and ground floor height requirements. The residential requirement is exactly the same, 1 space per dwelling unit, no spaces for the first 16 units. So the proposed changes would not go quite as far, but they would eliminate the residential requirements in the transit overlay district, and again, set a maximum of 2 spaces per unit for residential units, for residential uses, excuse me. And I want to note that there were some additional reductions, additional reductions that were provided in an omnibus text change that increased the reduction from 10 to 25% for uses within a quarter mile of transit. So that was passed in 2019, that text change, and this would address residential uses specifically. Also of note that the TOD district is not currently mapped, and that is an ongoing process within the Transportation and Transit Committee of the City Council. And there is thought that this would kind of preempt, that mapping and provide for, and think about proper minimum requirements within that specific district. Next slide, please. So multifamily is the third prong of the parking requirements portion of this text change. So before you is a table just providing a comparison of multifamily parking requirements against some comparison cities. So those boxes highlighted in red represent jurisdictions with the highest or tied for highest parking requirement. Those in green represent the lowest or tied for the lowest. And as you can see, Raleigh, against these particular cities, came out with some of the highest parking requirements. And so a big part of rethinking the multifamily or multi-unit living parking requirements was just to put us more in line with some other cities. And so that was definitely part of the analysis. Next slide, please. So here's the proposed changes. As you can see, the required spaces for 0 and 1 bedrooms, it's 1 spaces, and then it goes up 1 space per bedroom. Minor correction on 5+ bedrooms, it's actually 4.5 spaces and then 1 space per 10 units for visitors. The proposed changes would require still 1 space for studios and 1 bedroom units, and then an additional half space for every bedroom up to 5+ bedrooms. So this would be a kind of reduction in overall number of spaces that would have to be provided, and then also elimination of that minimum visitor parking requirement as well. Next slide, please. Moving on to the cottage court section of the text change. So this particular authorization was to reintroduce some of the changes that were originally introduced to council back in fall of 2019 as part of TC 618. So specifically, the biggest change of note would be to authorize or to permit cottage courts within the R2 and R4 zoning districts by right. And those would still be accompanied by the 50% density bonus. And so we've drafted some regulations, most of those taken from previous draft ordinances to accommodate that request. The second would be to increase the maximum number of dwelling units in a cottage court from 15 to 30. You all may remember that particular change because it did come out of the Planning Commission. And this is seen as a way particularly to address co-housing. 30 units is really seen as the kind of critical mass to address some of the financing concerns with that type of development. And again, it would not require them to be built to 30 units, dwelling units, but it would allow that flexibility for a larger cottage court development. The third change is something that staff noted in the regulations that we saw as kind of superfluous, would be eliminating the maximum sidewall height for dwelling units. The overall building height would still remain at 30 feet, which is significantly lower than for most other building types within the base zoning districts. However, maximum sidewall height was seen as not needed because it was intended to constrain overall dwelling unit size when there wasn't a maximum floor area, and now there is a maximum floor area of 1,800 square feet. And so we think this gives just a little bit more flexibility, and still, they're held to a more specific size. And if they so choose to go with a higher sidewall height, then that would be permitted. And lastly, you'll notice some changes that we made to other sections of the code just to improve the clarity of the regulations to make it a little bit easier for people to understand and administer. Next slide, please. Lastly, building height. So this is, again, kind of harkening back to a recommendation from the Planning Commission that was provided in fall of 2018. There was significant discussion about modifying maximum building height. And recently, in fall of 2019, the City Council approved a change to eliminate the maximum building height in feet requirement for District 7 stories and above. And this would raise the feet and height limit for 4 and 5 story zoning districts, just to provide, again, some flexibility that was offered to those larger zoning districts. In terms of floor to ceiling height, we had heard petitions that this would allow them to provide Class A office space that's desired especially the commercial real estate market. And so this, again, would be kind of going back to a previous recommendation from the Planning Commission. So that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to try to answer any specific questions you have about the ordinance.
Got my chiclet view back now. So are there any questions for staff? Commissioner Tomasula.
Hey, I had, I guess, just two specific questions. Some of the committee way back. But just curious about side setbacks in Cottage Court. Related, like, I'm not sure why it's 10 feet for buildings when all other detached structures are 5, and even a lot of more intense building parameters in R10 are 5 or 0 to 6 feet. And then I was also curious about the lot width minimum. I think we talked about that 45 feet is the standard width for single lots. So the idea of it being 90 feet wide instead of 100 seems to create more opportunity for this if that's the goal. And so those were just the two things that I was curious about.
So as it relates to the side setback, I think there was thought with this text change to basically mirror the existing regulations. I'm not privy to when the Cottage Court regulations were originally developed, but I would suppose that the side setback was a slightly greater than it might be for certain building types within those underlying districts, because it's seen as a site buffer as opposed to a buffer just between adjacent residences. The interior setback for any Cottage Court building will be 3 feet and minimum building separation of 6 feet. So within the development itself, those setbacks are pretty narrow. And this side setback that you see within the ordinance, I believe it's section 4, is in reference to the overall site. So the side areas of the site itself. And I think that, again, is just to provide some additional buffer. And it's not something we considered changing because we just really mirrored what was in the code already. But of course, we're open to just further discussion on that point. And then Commissioner Tomasula, if you could just repeat your question related to the site width.
So it's more so about the, a lot of this, my comments come down to like actual doability and application, and the fact that, in particular, I was just going through and reviewing it, and I noticed that something I think that we had discussed in committee was updated, I guess, once it was approved, but the minimum width is 100 feet for R10, but the minimum lot width is 45 in R10. And proportionally, for lesser lots, 2 lots could be combined to do an intimate Cottage Court, whereas with 2 conforming R10 lots, they would not be able to. You'd need 3. And most lots are 45 feet, not 50. And so for me, it seems like it really heightens the bar for applicability and actual delivery if we don't make it a little bit easier to attain. So I didn't know why it couldn't just be 90 if that's 2 R10 lots.
Understood. I believe this 100 feet, I would have to check TC 618, did represent a reduction from the current standards before the most recent text change was adopted. But your point is well taken. It's certainly something that could be used. I will note too that if that's the desire of the commission or comes out of as a recommendation, that site width is simply a minimum, and they'd still have to comply with the minimum net site area, which we think, I know specifically that site area was tested by some of our designers in the UDC, and they really thought that was the absolute minimum in terms of providing all of the applicable provisions within this part of the ordinance. But certainly it's something that could be changed, the site width, if that would help open it up.
Thank you. That actually was part of the underlying logic as well. That already controls. So if you meet all the setbacks and the minimum width, what's the frontage really matter? I mean, there should be a minimum, but because of the constraints through design, there's a built-in minimum.
Would like to reinforce Keegan is correct. Before the last cottage court text change, the original figure in the UDO was 150 feet for width. So it was reduced. This would, of course, there's nothing standing in the way of a further reduction if that's the will of the commission.
Other questions for staff? Okay, the city is the applicant, so if there are no questions for staff, we're going to move on to those who have signed up to speak. And we have only one person on the docket to speak, Mary Galogi, I believe is the name. And so could we bring Mary Galogi on? You will have 2 minutes to speak in favor of this text change.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes, and please pronounce your name because I'm not sure I slaughtered it.
Sure. My name is Mary Gilogly. And I just wanted to also mention that I do hope I'm going about this the correct way. So please, please feel free to correct me if I'm not, but I'm actually addressing 2 different topics today. And this is one of them.
I'll just speak on this one for now.
Sure. Well, I wanted to basically include on just one total statement that does go across both, just so I don't waste your time. It's very fast. And so I will just go ahead and do that, and you can tell me what to go from there. So again, my name is Mary Gilogly. Good morning, everyone. I live at 2904 Deborah Drive in Raleigh. I am a spokesperson of a group of over 400 members that work together in the Raleigh metro area to support increased opportunities to affordable and sustainable housing, and in particular, tiny home living. Thank you for permitting us to address the Commission on items TC 1619 and TC-1-20, as we strongly support both of these recommended text changes. On item TC-16-19, we support the removal of the overlay district requirements and allowing ADUs on residential units by right. These text changes provide opportunity to diversify and expand housing options and affordability within the city. The ordinance supplies significant safeguards to prevent abuse of this policy, yet provides a more streamlined approach for ADU permit approval. ADUs are important for providing housing options for housing for senior or caregivers, or our seniors can age in place, for students completing their education, for our veterans returning from duty, and for our young folks staying out needing safe. And I apologize. I'm getting to the right one. I promise.
Yeah, you've gone over time as well.
I have. Oh my gosh, that was 10 minutes.
Yeah, it was two minutes. 2 minutes is what you had. So
I apologize.
Yeah, because we spoke for about a minute trying to set up what you were going to say. I'm going to give you another minute.
Okay, I'm almost done, and then
yeah,
and then I'll be done. So let's see here. I just want to make sure I'm addressing the right one. Okay. On item TC-120, we support the reduction of parking requirements and strongly support the expansion of the usage and size of cottage court developments. Obviously I'm reading this. I apologize, you guys. I'm just a representative. Promoting the usage of cottage courts by increasing the maximum number of dwelling units in any one cottage court from 15 to 30 is an excellent amendment, as it is allowing cottage courts by rights within the R2 and R4 zoning districts with an accompanying 50% density bonus. We agree that increasing the number of dwelling units per cottage court will incentivize the development and assist with the creation of co-housing. Again, the recommended text exchanges will help create more affordable, sustainable housing here in Raleigh without jeopardizing established character of existing neighborhoods. And I will just wrap this up. Finally, we just want to thank you guys for your leadership and staff and working to provide the options for affordable and sustainable housing. And we would like to propose that we could work together with the planning staff in the steps of implementing zoning and boarding ordinances to be friendly towards tiny houses.
Okay, your
That's
time
it.
is
That's
up.
it. Okay, I'm so sorry. That's all I got.
All right, thank you.
Okay.
All right, are there any questions for Ms.
Galogly.
Any questions? Okay, thank you. Thank you for coming to speak.
Yeah, I thank you.
All right, so let's bring it back to the table, so to speak. Let's have questions and comments from the commissioners. Does anyone have questions or comments that they would like to make at this time? Please raise your hand. Wow, nobody. All right, well, there are some things that I would like to get into the record since, again, I think that we are having some difficulty with people understanding how to get involved in these meetings right now. And we've had several emails from folks about this TC 120. We had a number of emails from one area that supported, or one group that supported both TC1 and 20 just in general, but there were some very specific emails about particular concerns that I would like to get on the record. And I just messed up my word. So an email from Pam Davis said she was concerned about the parking requirements as it relates to infill development in residential neighborhoods. So for staff, how does this affect infill development in residential neighborhoods?
Was there any additional commentary or just generally in how it would impact infill?
So her specific thing was Grant Avenue Apartments in Cameron Hills was rezoned to RX3 in 2016. This property is located on and surrounded by neighborhood streets with limited parking. There are no sidewalks in the neighborhood except for in front of apartments in adjacent townhomes on Baez Street. The site plan for a 321 unit multi-building apartment complex was submitted in December to replace about 100 current cottage apartments. The plan calls for 158 one-bedroom, 142 two-bedroom, and 21 three-bedroom units. I understand a plan could be resubmitted to take advantage of any text changes for the parking requirements. A minimum of 537 spaces would be required under the current rule, but 413 spaces would be required under the proposed standard. I have concerns about parking shortages for the neighborhood, difficulty for service truck and school buses, and most importantly, increased safety concerns for pedestrians. And then she sent us some photos with Grant Avenue pedestrians in the street and a public utility truck trying to get by and a recycling truck. So can you speak to her concerns about what would happen if this text change goes through with that particular 321 unit multi-building apartment complex?
Hold on. So we'll assume that the applicant's analysis is correct. It sounds correct in terms of the number of required spaces. There is a development plan under review. It is been submitted under the current code, and so whatever is proposed on that site is currently compliant. We are unaware, they would have the option of bringing forth a revised development plan that would provide fewer overall parking spaces, and but we can't predict whether they would do that or not, or whether they're satisfied with the development plan that they have.
So this text change would allow them to come back and reduce the number of parking spaces.
Yes, they don't have an approval yet.
Right.
So, and even if they had an approval, they could always submit a new development plan. Now, obviously, there's time, expense associated with doing that they would have to weigh off across it, but they would always have that option until the project starts construction. So then the next question is, would there be an adverse impact? the text change that's in front of you was predicated on information that we've received, as well as just anecdotal information that our current requirements are excessive, that they're requiring more spaces than are actually demanded in these developments. So if they're lowered somewhat, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be parking spillover, but if you lower the requirements enough, then there certainly could be. Or is the text change in front of you at that point based on our benchmarks with other communities, staff's general sense of? We've also reviewed this against some of the parking alternates that we have approved in the past that have been based on actual parking counts in comparable multifamily developments. Obviously, every location is somewhat unique. This isn't as urban as the parking, as the developments in Cameron Village or say out at the 40 Wade development. But many of those developments were parked at ratios far lower than what's required in this ordinance, and they seem to have been functioning reasonably well. So I can't give you a definitive answer as to whether there'll be an adverse impact, other than to say that that staff believes that this text change is generally within the realm of what a multifamily development in a typical location in Raleigh would demand, and that our current ordinance is demanding more spaces than technically should be required.
Okay. And I have another email I would like to read into the record from Stephanie Pierce. This text change makes it easier for developers while not thinking about the current or new residents moving into an area. While this may be considered an urban area, the public transportation infrastructure barely exists. Of course, my personal comment is we're trying to address that. Currently, the narrow streets in many areas make on the street parking challenging for the people who live on certain streets and the people who travel through certain streets. Additionally, the assumption is being made that most people who reside in Raleigh, work in Raleigh, or have commutes in or around public transportation. Raleigh has made strides with its bus service, but before you can allow developers to provide less parking for their structure, more upgrades are needed for the limited to many areas bus service that exists. It seems illogical to move ahead with changes and proposals made prior to the pandemic without knowing what a post-pandemic Raleigh may actually be. These plans are pro-high density, pro-high population, and with the current national and global economic problems, they don't seem to be feasible at this time, as the jobs are not here. And most issues during the pandemic were high density populated cities, and now many residents in those cities are rethinking close quarters city lifestyle living. To change the text at this time, cutting a break to developers will not help the city, as more people favor their personal automobiles because they have to socially distance better. So I just wanted to get that one into the record, since perhaps someone with those kinds of feelings might actually show up if they had gotten through the process. And then we had an email from Will Yadeski about the effect of the changes to Cottage Court. And I assume staff saw his email with some green numbers, and I wasn't clear about what he was suggesting, whether he was asking for changes to what additional changes over what's being proposed in this text change. Did anyone have a chance to take a look at that and from staff and determine what it was he was asking and whether we are already addressing those concerns?
Chair, would you mind just repeating the exact question? I do have a memo here, and maybe it made its way into there. If not, then I would potentially Ken and or Travis would have a little bit more information.
Mr. Yadeski had marked up some data in his email, and I was not clear what it is that he was trying to get across to us in his comments, and thought maybe that someone on staff had understood and could say whether he was proposing something different from what we're considering at this point, or whether he is in line with what we are considering at this point.
I don't believe I have the email in question.
Okay, I believe it went to all of the Planning Commission, so maybe Mr. Crane has it.
That's correct. So it was sent to Planning Commission and City Council on Thursday, sometime in the late afternoon. So my interpretation of Mr. Udesky's email is that he's requesting consideration of reduction of net site area, site width, site depth, and the additional area required for units, additional units in the cottage court across the board in the R2, R4, R6, and R10 zoning districts, and has just requested consideration again of reduction of all of those minimum standards.
Okay. And so we are not currently contemplating the reductions that he is suggesting. Correct?
Right. I would agree with that. I don't think staff is currently contemplating that, only because of the timing with which he submitted the comments.
All right. But they don't fall under what we've got in front of us to consider. They are over and above what we have to consider.
That's correct.
Yeah, they're beyond the scope of, I mean,
yeah.
Obviously,
well, not just beyond the scope, that they're more reduced than what we're considering.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So I see hands up for other commissioners to speak. So I will start at the top where I see Commissioner Miller.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I know that we can consider anything at each meeting, but given the timing that this was submitted, I would be interested in looking at this and discussing this with him and with other technical and design professionals more carefully, especially since we have time with one more meeting. And we have several other comments as well from folks related to parking and building height and some of the other technical requirements. And since we have only 29 minutes left in this, and I suspect we have significant additional comments to the ADUs and others, I would propose deferring this and moving this question to the next meeting so that we can move on to so that we can both fully address these comments at the next meeting, and we can move on to the ADUs for this meeting so that we can get in as many comments as possible and hopefully see some amended language at our next meeting as well.
Director Bowers.
So understood, and you are running short on time in this meeting. And I conferred offline with Travis and with Mr. York on the council's understanding of the time extension. At the time, you had requested 45 days. At the meeting, they asked for 30. It was their understanding that they would get these text changes back on June the 2nd. However, their understanding, I think, which was based on a sort of off the cuff, on the fly response to the change in the number of days, was technically not correct. So you do have to June 9th. I'm just letting you know that there was a council expectation that the text changes would be back on June 2nd. Staff is in a position to make an explanation on that. As it relates to the public hearing date, there is still an opportunity, even if you do not make your recommendation until June 9th, for it to appear on the second council meeting in June and for it to be placed on the July 7th public hearing date. So in terms of the timing of the adoption, is still the same. There is less opportunity for the council to deliberate and make changes on the text changes between now and July 7th, if they get it at their second meeting.
Okay, so going on to Commissioner Tomasula, I saw your hand up, and I saw Commissioner Hicks. I'll get you next.
I support that. I also would support just moving this out with a minor amendment of updating the minimum width to 90 feet instead of 100, based on the logic discussed earlier. If no one else has any other issues and sees supporting that, I'd be happy to move that out with that recommendation as well, and it as an option to not delaying it at the table, but I would support that as well.
All right, Commissioner Hicks.
I had a few comments, questions about this text change, and I know we're trying to move on to the next one. but I'd like to be able to go ahead and ask them. Under multi-unit living, the maximum surface parking, I just wanted to understand that a little bit better. I, of course, support reduced parking, in denser areas. It says currently the UDO requires additional stormwater mitigation if you have parking is provided in excess of 150% of the required parking ratios. And in this text change, it would further expand the maximum surface parking exemptions to cover multi-unit living and townhouses and cottage courts. And my question is, if they're providing above and beyond the required parking ratios, and we're trying to reduce what they're required to provide, I'm not sure I support reducing their requirement to mitigate stormwater. It seems like as a city, we're trying to address that overall. And so first question is, am I reading that correctly? And second would be a comment that I don't think I would be in support of that.
All right, and I understand that Commissioner Bennett also had her hand up.
Yes, thank you. I was just going to say, with regard to the parking requirements text change, I'm generally supportive of reducing parking requirements. My concern is that typically goes along with a fairly robust transit infrastructure. And I'm not sure that we have the transit to support reducing the parking. So I'm concerned about the indirect consequences of not having that alternative. If people aren't allowed to park, then are they going to have to find private lots to park and pay? If we're going to do more permit parking, is that going to start increasing enforcement costs and issues? If we're adding additional street parking, is that going to work counter to our desire to have more walkable and bicycle-friendly streets? So I have those questions and concerns about reducing the parking requirements prior to having the infrastructure in place to offer people viable alternatives.
Thank you. Commissioner Lampman. Sorry, let's get it right yet. Demerit.
I agree with Commissioner Bennett's comments. I think that, quite frankly, with Matt Tomasulo as well, this discussion of, the cottage courts, I agree that, that setback requirement needs to be changed. But in terms of parking, having that be a separate issue, I completely agree that this will put a tremendous amount of pressure, good or bad, on transportation to improve transportation alternatives to cars. I think naturally we're going in that direction. So I think some of that will be, included. But if we don't have a strong path on the direction we're taking in terms of providing alternative modes of transportation, this will create additional pressure for that, good or bad. Just wanted to make that point.
Commissioner Hicks.
Yeah, I had two more comments. One was on the building height. I wanted to recommend we just move both the 4 and 5 story to 16 feet per story, and just, I'm not sure why it's varying between the 4 and the 5. That would put, that would put the 4 story at 64 feet tall, and that would keep the 5 story at 80. So I wanted to make that suggestion. And then additionally, in some of the feedback that we got from the public, I just wanted to read this for public record and sort of pose the question. Somebody who lives at 40, didn't have a name, 4217 Greencastle Court, made the comment that parking is already scarce enough, and I'm concerned that this will affect already limited handicap parking. And I do support reducing the parking, but I think it'd be important to make an assessment of what the impact would be on accessible parking, so that we are, providing access for people that may have mobility issues.
Thank you.
Sorry, I'm making notes. Commissioner Tomasulo, I saw your hand next.
One point of clarification, or maybe Travis, do single family homes that are 3, 4, or 5 bedroom require the same parking requirements? So does a 5-bedroom house require 5 parking spaces or 2?
No, it's just a flat rate for single family homes, 2 spaces.
Regardless of size.
Spaces, regardless of size.
That's right.
Okay. So underlying in the code, this logic is present. The proposed logic of parking for other units.
Well, under this text change, multi-unit living of 4 or more bedrooms would still require more than 2 spaces per unit. So for 4 bedrooms, you'd have 2.5, and for 5, you would have 3.
Correct.
So,
okay.
So it applies somewhat up to that
single
point.
Family. Okay. It's still in excess of single. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Commissioner Fox. I thought I saw your hand up earlier. Okay. Commissioner Winters. Yeah.
Is it possible to break these into individual pieces as opposed to keeping them together? Can I motion that we break these into individual pieces rather than keeping them together?
I would ask our staff, either planning or Mr. York, if he could weigh in on that.
Your intent would be to report out some, but not all of this text change today. You have done that in the past, and staff has assigned a letter in parentheses next to the text change number. So instead of being TC120, you'd have TC1A 20, TC1B 20.
So that's a possibility.
It is a possibility.
Right.
Okay.
Okay.
Are there under?
I'd actually feel more comfortable doing that because they're so different. I just feel more comfortable to be cleaner for just a clean vote.
Okay. So are there any other comments? Because I'd like to make just a couple. Okay. Some people, I can't see their cameras, so if you have anything, I can't see your raised hand. So I'm also concerned about the parking requirement situation for the foreseeable future, because I do think COVID and coronavirus will have some impact on our willingness to use shared transportation and whether that's Uber, Lyft, and our bus transit system. I don't know how long that's going to last. You know, some of us that know scientists believe that this is going to be with us for a long while. It's going to take us a while to get it under control, and people are going to feel more comfortable in their cars than if we want them to go to businesses in some way distant from their house. They're going to want to drive in their own car that they know that they've sanitized. So I'm experiencing a great deal of concern about reducing parking right now. I would not be opposed to it in the future, because I really do want to see us move to a time in the future when we are using shared vehicles. But this doesn't feel like the time to me. This is a time where we need to sort through what our lives are going to be like in the next 5 years. So I would be reluctant to act on the parking part of this. You know, the cottage court thing doesn't make me happy with some of the changes that are being proposed there, but I can live with those. The building height thing, I could live with that. So if we wanted to break it apart and not act on the parking part of it, I could vote on the other two.
Thank you.
So anyway, those are my thoughts at this time. Does anyone have anything else before we decide what we're going to do with this case today?
I have one more, just to clarify.
Okay.
So, not to report out, what does that mean towards council? If we were to break them apart and not report on one, what will that mean? If it's delayed, or they'll take it as a no vote from us and they still vote, what does that mean?
So the item isn't in front of them until it's reported out. If you break this into pieces and take the parking out of it and hold on to it for another 2 weeks, you will, they'll be receiving that report at their second meeting of June. Or if for some reason the Planning Commission never takes a vote on it at all, they'll receive it. It'll just move back to them without a Planning Commission report. Those are the options. If your desire today is to recommend that they not move forward with the parking provision, I think you can put that in your certified recommendation without breaking them in two. But if your desire is to deliberate on it more and make a report out on June 9th, then breaking it into two pieces is the way that you could do that.
All right, well, let's go through our options real quickly with hands raised. So does anyone want to vote on it as it stands with recommendations for two parts, getting a vote of whatever, and the parking being something that we choose to not vote on today? I think that's one of the options. Well, so raise your hand if you want to do that. Did I say that right? Maybe Ken can. I'm sorry. Maybe Ken can say it better. I'm trying to do what Ken's proposed, which is the first one where we deal with the building heights and Cottage Court, but not parking.
Right. So you would essentially report this out, break the text change into two pieces. TC1A would be all the stuff except for the parking reductions. And just to be clear, because we're lumping two different things, there's three parking reductions that are being talked about. One is eliminating the minimums in the DX downtown. The other is eliminating medium minimums for residential in the transit overlay district, which in the near term has no impact because that district is not mapped anywhere. And then the third item is to reduce the parking requirements in the parking table that are generic across the city for the multi-unit living. And I would just like to say that because those apply all over the city, there was no assumption made about transits, there being any transit service whatsoever. They would apply in the multifamily developments in places with minimal to no transit service just as much as they would apply in other areas. The UDO typically maps urban frontages in places where there's higher transit uses, and they provide significant reductions. So I just want to make that clarification that we were not, in proposing these at the staff level, predicating it on a particular level of transit service. These are base requirements that would apply everywhere in the city. They were based more on the indications we had that the current requirements, even in places with no transit, were requiring more spaces than were needed for the development. So with those clarifications about the parking, I'm assuming that what you're talking about is reporting out today those portions of the ordinance that don't include the DX, don't include the TOD parking, and don't include the multi-unit living parking reductions. Those would become TCB, and you would hold on to them for another 2 weeks for more deliberation to report them out. So the motion would be to make that split and to make your recommendation on TC1A and hold TC1B at the table to your next meeting.
How many people want to do that? Raise your hand. Okay, how many people want to vote on it as it stands? Raise your hand. All right, and so so we have more people who want to vote on it today. So I will go, yeah, Commissioner Thomas.
As a point of clarification, just so I better understand, with regard to what Mr. Bauer said, I'm trying to just understand what new information we will have regarding parking next week or at the next meeting that will change the feelings around this.
I think more opportunity to consider what's in there and understand it better, because this is really, I think, the first time we've heard this case, is it not?
It's been on the agenda, but
it's been on the agenda, but we haven't heard it until today.
Yeah.
All right. So Commissioner Bennett, I saw your hand, and then I see Commissioner Winters. So let's start with Commissioner Bennett.
So is there not an option that if we separate these out, we can vote on each one? It seems like the option was separating them out and just not considering the parking or voting on the whole thing as is. Is there not a third where we can separate them out and vote on each one?
I believe that we could probably do that.
That is one way to do it, but if you're voting on both of them, I think you could accomplish the same thing by essentially recommending denial, if that's where you're going, of the parking sections of the ordinance without separating them out. You would separate.
Okay, thank you.
So what you want to do is vote up on some components and others. All you have to do is reference the sections that you want denied out of the ordinance text and say, we're recommending denial of these sections and approval of the remainder.
Commissioner Winters is next.
No, I mean, that was my point, because I was wanting to separate but still have the vote today as opposed to delaying.
Okay.
Okay, so there's no need to create a 1A and a 1B for that. You can simply, Mr. York.
Well, I was just going to say, it could be that they all three pass, but one's unanimous or two are unanimous and one's a split vote. If you vote on each item separately, otherwise someone who has a concern would be voting. It shouldn't be all or nothing. I think if you voted cottage court, then you vote parking, then you vote building height or whatever order, then it could be that they all receive positive votes, but it just varies in whether it's a supermajority or a minor, or some may fail.
Okay.
But
excellent point.
I propose that we do that. Does that work for everybody? I see nodding heads. All right. So then we need somebody to make the motion on each portion. Is that as you suspect? Okay. So I'm willing to entertain a motion at this point.
I'll make a motion.
Sorry. Yeah. Sorry, I was making a note. Commissioner Tomasulo, please go ahead.
So and maybe in an effort to streamline this, I will make a motion to approve TC 1A-20. Can I make a motion for each one independently as A, B, and C so that we have the motions made and then we can vote on each one?
I think that's fine.
Okay, so then I will move approval for TC-1A-20. The proposed text change is consistent with relevant policies and comprehensive plan, and believe that it better positions us to fall in line with a lot of other markets and to allow for more nimble parking accommodations. I recommend approval for TC 1B-20 with one amendment. It didn't sound like anyone had any issues with the 90 feet, but I will make that amendment to add 90 feet down from 100. Everything else remaining the same. That is consistent with the relevant policies in the comprehensive plan, and approval of the proposed text amendment is reasonable in the public interest. It's providing varied and much needed housing options in the area. And then also recommend approval TC1C-20. It's consistent with the relevant policies in the comp plan, and approval of the proposed text amendment is reasonable in the public interest.
You wish to add TICA's recommendation for 16 feet per story?
Well, I was just going to say, from the background that I had from this, and maybe this is clarification from Ken, but I thought that the reason that this came to be was because of so many issues in site review.
Okay.
With interpretation to building height. So.
All right, don't let me slow your roll. I'm just wanted to get that in there.
And so with full respect to Tika's comment, I totally hear that, Tika. It was from my notes, I thought that the building height originated out of need, not desire. And so that is the reason that I'm voting that forward. So thank you. Yeah. Thank you for that, Edie. And that's all three.
Okay. Do we have a second? All right. Commissioner Miller, would you like to make a second?
Second.
All right, so now we will have Janitha make a roll call for each of the 3 sections. Oh,
Can you just restate like what it is that we're approving just one more time, just so that we are perfectly crystal clear? So A
is parking. A is parking. B is cottage court. C is building heights for 4 and 5 stories.
To approve all 3 with the exception of B with the 90-foot.
We're going to do each one at a time. So we're going to take a roll call for A, which is the parking. We're going to take a roll call for B, which is the cottage court with the amendment for 90 feet, and we're going to take a roll call for C, which is the building heights.
And the proposal was that we approve all 3, correct?
That was the motion made, so you can vote against it or you can vote for it. Are you ready? It sounds like a drum back there. Wow. All right, Janitha, are you ready? Okay.
So this one is for TC1. Commissioner Bennett, how do you?
This is 1A?
Yes,
parking.
1A20?
Nay.
Does someone have a phone vibrating on their desk? That's what it sounds like.
No, there's actually a jackhammer operating right outside One Exchange Plaza today.
Commissioner Fox, how do you vote?
Aye.
I apologize, I can't hear you.
I vote aye in approval.
Thank you. Commissioner Hicks?
For parking, I vote nay, although I'd like to make the comment that I do support the reduction in parking. I'd just prefer to have a little more time to discuss this section. Thank you.
Chair Jeffries?
Nay.
Commissioner Lampman?
Nay, with the same comment. I'd like additional time to deliberate on parking.
Commissioner Mann?
Aye.
Commissioner McIntosh?
Aye.
Commissioner Miller?
Aye.
Commissioner Tomasulo?
Aye.
And Commissioner Winters?
Nay.
Nay.
So, Janitha, I lost track. I had a bunny, a bunstruction take place in my living room, so I don't know what she just did. So I've lost count. Where did we end up? For parking.
Okay.
I think it was 5-5.
5-5, yes.
Okay. So that, do we have to revote for that then? Or do we just, no recommendation?
No, the motion fails.
Motion fails. All right, on a 5-5 vote. All right.
Should we keep going and come back to that, or?
Yep, that's what I'd like to do.
Yeah, I would suggest you go ahead and complete the vote, and then we can address A afterwards.
All right, let's go to Cottage Court.
Cottage Court is TC1B-20, correct?
Yes, that would be the Cottage Court.
Bennett, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Fox? Commissioner Fox?
Aye.
Commissioner Hicks?
Aye.
Chair Jeffries?
Aye.
Commissioner Lampman?
Aye.
Commissioner Mann?
Aye.
Commissioner McIntosh?
Aye.
Commissioner Miller?
Oops, sorry.
Aye.
Commissioner Lowe?
Aye.
And Commissioner Winters?
Aye.
So by my count, that was unanimous.
Yes, ma'am.
All right. So that motion carries unanimously. All right. Now on to the section for building height.
TC 1C-20. Commissioner Bennett, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Fox?
Aye.
Commissioner Hicks?
Aye.
Chair Jeffries?
Aye.
Commissioner Lampman?
Aye.
Commissioner Mann?
Aye.
Commissioner McIntosh?
Aye.
Commissioner Miller?
Aye.
Commissioner Tomasulo?
Aye.
And Commissioner Winters?
Aye.
All right. I have that as the motion carries unanimously. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. So let's return to the parking part of the text change and the motion failing 5-5. So Mr. York, can you guide us here?
Yeah, if you want, you can either have someone make a motion to deny it, or you can move that be held for 2 weeks and then report out sections B and C. Or,
Okay. You're about to say or?
that, I mean, your vote would be, you basically break it up into Part A and Part B. Part B is what you voted on unanimously. In Part A, you hold back.
Okay.
You report out after your next meeting.
Commissioner Lampton has a question. Lampman has a question.
If it's, I don't have to make a firm motion right now, but I'd like to make the motion that we hold A for 2 weeks and move out B and C.
I'll second that. So, Janitha, would you like to take a roll on that, please?
Yes, ma'am. Can you repeat what that was for, please?
I'm making the motion to hold A for 2 weeks and move out B and C.
And I second it.
And if we vote against that, that means that we,
What
does that mean?
You want to, I guess, provide another vote today of denial.
Okay.
So let's do the roll call.
Commissioner Bennett, how do you vote?
I'm sorry, what does the name mean again?
Excuse me, real quick, there's 2 things you can do. I mean, if someone is considering changing their vote so that there would no longer be a tie, they can just make a motion either in favor or against Section A, and you can vote again and see if the tie breaks. If no one's considering changing their vote, then you need to vote to hold Part A at the table for 2 weeks. And I would report out the balance of the text change as Part B. I know you voted on it twice, but they received the same vote. So you would hold Part A, which is parking, and report out the balance of the text change as Part B to the City Council.
Okay, so aye.
Commissioner Fox, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Hicks?
Aye.
Chair Jeffries?
Aye.
Commissioner Lampman?
Aye.
Commissioner Mann?
Aye.
Commissioner McIntosh?
Aye.
Commissioner Miller?
Aye.
Commissioner Tomasulo?
Aye.
Commissioner Winters?
Aye.
Okay, so I count that as a unanimous support for the motion to hold Part A for 2 weeks and bring it back to the table then, and move forward Part B, which is the cottage court and the building heights, out and report that out to council from this meeting as recommended approval.
Right.
All right. So we have reached noon. We're actually afternoon, and we haven't gotten to a very large case, which is TC 1619, but it has been pointed out that we could take this up at the next Planning Commission meeting, which I would recommend at this time because, you know, when I get a chance to talk, I have plenty I want to say. I don't know about everybody else. Is there any objection to moving this off to the next meeting? Do we have, how about staff? Do any thoughts about that? Mr.
No.
Bowers? Okay, so we're going to move that out to the next meeting. Okay. Mr. Tomasulo, what would you like to say?
I do have a question. You know, this is a very important text change for our city, and it has been lingering for a very long time. Committees, you know, we don't have the infrastructure for committees to meet. There are a lot of things in here that, in this text change, that have been, that fall really short of kind of standards in the industry, particularly in other communities. And there isn't just one or two small changes. And I know I've sent information multiple times to staff, and I know a lot of other people have, and we haven't seen any revised texts at all. And I see there being no way that I could ever support anything that would arrive, like no verbal confirmation will get me anywhere next week with what we need this to be effective in our community. And so I guess I don't know what the solution is, you know, or obviously in very different, challenging, unknown territory, but I guess I just ask that fellow commissioners really spend some time with this and review it, because the reason we have the committee, you know, is so that we can deliberate for an hour and a half on this stuff and really ask candid conversations, you know, to staff to better understand things. And so I know it's burdensome on staff. I know it's burdensome on us, but I guess I just wonder if there's a way that we can, whether it's have a bunch of comments and then a variety of text updates per section or per number, because I personally think there's some things in there that contradict each other, and from a code-based standpoint, just I'm super confused by when I try and draw it on paper. And so, you know, if we're gonna, I think this format is very challenging when we're on the clock to figure this out. And so, you know, I don't know if we can have a special session. I know it takes a lot more work. Or if we go back to council and just ask for an extra 30 days to actually handle this appropriately. But, you know, I just do not see, I see it being reckless to try and think that we're going to get anything that's usable out of the next meeting. And I do know that council can change things at the table, but I personally, as an elected body and as a public, you know, body, that I feel like it would be reckless to provide 15 different verbal amendments to move this out to council.
Commissioner Lamon.
Matt, if you care to make a motion to request a 30-day extension from council, I would support you in that.
Oh, excuse me, Commissioner Miller. Excuse me.
I just wanted to support what Commissioner Tomasulo was saying. You know, I know that, and I've spoken with him outside of meetings, and we have, you know, probably collectively spent 20, 30 hours on some of these text changes and on the technical legal drafting, on the technical requirements, on how these very significant changes interact with other sections of the code. We've had dozens of emails and letters and calls and meetings with members of the general public that are also concerned about how this text change is drafted. I would encourage, whatever the format is, if it's a special meeting, if it's a committee meeting, if it turns out it needs to be another full committee meeting, we have asked several times to have this moved up on the agenda. This was supposed to be on the Planning Commission and other agenda meetings several times. We've asked for it to be moved up. It was never moved up. In fact, it's only been moved to the back of the meeting. I'm concerned that it has occurred. I'm concerned why that may have occurred. And I totally agree that if we were to pass this out with the same haste that we passed this cottage court and parking height and building height and parking requirement text change, that is bordering on reckless on how we are drafting the code for our city, and we are not doing our responsibility as a public body. So, I would encourage all members of the Planning Commission, whoever is going to end up participating in that meeting, to do their homework beforehand, to draft specific comments, to look at all of the technical comments that the technical professionals have provided to us, and to actually move it up on the next meeting agenda and not to move it back. If anyone tries to move it back on the agenda again, I will make a motion that we change that immediately. And that, the next meeting is not a discussion about generally whether ADUs are a good policy idea, and that's what people talk about or read emails about for a significant portion of the meeting, when we need to be getting into the detailed text of how this code language is written and how it interacts with other sections of the code. So I would absolutely support moving forward, or moving to have an additional 30 days to work on it. But I would also ask that the other members of the commission sort of do a significant amount of homework beforehand so that it can be a productive meeting. Thank you.
So before we go on, I just want to address what sounds to me like a bit of an accusation about the movement of the text change to the bottom of the agendas. We have had a lot of zoning cases to process this year, more than we usually do. And those people bring paid staff to those meetings and attorneys. And so I felt it was my responsibility to take care of those first, since these are city-initiated text changes. And so I just want to make sure that people understand that that was my intention, is to process those first, and I can't help that we ran out of time. So that's where we were with those. And I apologize if that is offensive to people that we didn't get to the text change, but timing is timing. We all have busy lives. We're all volunteers. I did suggest special meetings, but we ran out of time for that. So there wasn't an opportunity to process this in a more timely fashion, but there was no strategy to that. That's just how it ended up being with the number of zoning cases that we had to deal with at the time. So.
This is Ken. It is certainly within your rights to ask for an additional time extension from the council. You should recognize that it's not certain that you will receive it. Another option to continue your discussion, and we've been having some internal staff chat on this, would be to schedule a special meeting between now and June 9th, where this would be the only item on the agenda, where some of these issues about the specific requirements of the ordinance could be hashed out prior to, now that may be difficult from a public comment standpoint, but you would still have the June 9th meeting where it would appear as a regular agenda item in order to do that. So we'll just throw that out as a suggestion for how you might be able to move on this, recognizing that there's not a certainty that you would receive your 30-day extension.
If other members are comfortable with that, I would fully support that. I think this is important enough that we give it its earnest time.
I'm happy for us to have a special meeting, so we would need for staff to get us together. So is staff willing to send out a survey to try to get us into a special meeting?
Yes, ma'am. We can send something out today and poll the members to see when everyone is available to meet.
Okay.
Can I?
I'm sorry.
Can you hear me?
Can
I ask them?
Is that Commissioner Winters? I can't tell.
I appreciate the comments that are going forward and the robust conversation that has come from it, and just also to share that we all do work hard and we all do our due diligence because we're appointed here and to serve Raleigh the best we can. So just wanted to make that statement as well, that we're all doing the work.
Thank you, Commissioner Winters. All right, so I don't believe we need to make any, Mr. York.
I was just going to throw out one more suggestion. If everyone could check their calendars and see if June 2nd, the morning of June 2nd works. I believe we have, or if you can find a common day next week that works for everybody, we could adjourn this meeting to reconvene on that day at a specific time.
June 2nd is good for me.
I can make it work.
I can do it.
Good for me.
I can do it.
All right, so we're going to adjourn this meeting and continue on June 2nd. Is that correct?
What time?
And staff would suggest a 9 o'clock start time.
Just like a usual planning commission, 9 to 12. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So we'll pick up again on June 2nd. Oh, Mr. Tomasula.
One final, Chris, one thing that I didn't fully realize or have the context of that I just wanted to share with the rest of the commissioners through this, you know, I just didn't realize kind of the lead time and things like that staff needs to like process and reply and respond to things, and then lead time to get something in the actual report and things like that. And so I've learned a lot about that through this as well. And so I think that can help too if while people are, I was always just behind the curve, so I could never get my comments in time to get a reply. And so I don't know if staff has like recommendations for us to like, if there's some like preliminary questions we have, et cetera, like what seems reasonable in prep for these meetings, so that if there is research or interpretation that's needed, you know, certainly can ask tons of questions at the meeting, but I just didn't know, certain things might need some extra work. I didn't know if there's any best practices around that.
I gather that's a question for staff. So is there anything that staff wants to respond to Mr. Tomasula?
Well, so it's
how it's most helpful for us to interact with you. Yeah.
Sure. It's helpful if commissioners have questions about certain sections in the proposed ordinance. If you want to gain clarification, we can help do that in advance of the meeting. We can even, time permitting, provide response so everyone on the commission can see all of the questions and answers. What is more difficult for staff to react to is if individual commissioners send us in comments that they would like to see the text changed this way or that way. We respond to the body as a whole and not to individual commissioners. So if you would like for us to start exploring maybe the impact of a regulation, we could do that, but we can't wholesale make changes to the ordinance based on the suggestion of one commissioner.
Right.
Okay. So when we get into that, one other comment, I just want to clarify before we get into June 2nd meeting. So since it is a public meeting, are we going to make time for public input at that meeting? Is that something that we would be required to do as a public meeting?
So I don't know that it's something we're required to do. If the commission would like for us to explore the possibility of doing so, we can. My only comment would be that it's a very quick turnaround for us. We have to meet with IT to update our website and get the form ready to publish before we launch it for public comment. So we would not have a very large window there.
So what we can do instead is encourage people to continue to post comments to the location where they posted the other comments. Is that correct? We can reopen that if it's not open now.
No, we would have to reopen that portal again.
Okay.
So what might be helpful is if we encourage people to continue to send the Planning Commission email comments,
Okay.
because you all receive that.
Okay. All right. So then it sounds to me like our intention is not to open that meeting up to public comment, and instead this will be for us to process this text change. Commissioner Lampton, I see your hand.
Yeah, I have one other question regarding people meeting outside, which I fully support because I think that that's an ability for people to process information. But I have heard that what is the limit? Because, for example, I would love to get together with Matt and talk about this. And if you need to hear from commissioners as a whole, but if we meet outside, I think that there's an issue about not being in quorum or something about that meeting outside meetings. Can you elaborate on that? Because I'd love to be able to communicate with the fellow commissioners, to understand more. So
one-on-one conversations with each other is fine to discuss things. You want to avoid group gatherings because if it gets too many, such as a quorum, or if it's a quorum of a committee, then you're into the public meetings and they have to be noticed. And so if you're just wanting to talk to one other council member or one other commissioner about a particular issue and talk it through, you can do that. And then you can have the exact same conversation with another member. I would suggest, limiting it and not having conversations with more than 3 at any given time, preferably just 2.
right, but then I think that also then creates an issue where we were just told that if they represent the body and not an individual. So I do think that we do have the right to. I mean, we don't want to make it public, but I want to understand what all that is, because I think, again, to everybody's point here, that this is an important one that we need to discuss. But if we're limited in our ability to discuss offline, and you can't then take a comment directly from Matt, then that's actually kind of an issue. I think that these things should be come up and brought to the attention of everybody, because Matt knows things I don't know. And I'd like to be able to know and understand those things.
I think what Travis was saying is we don't go back and rewrite draft ordinances based on the comment of one member.
Right.
If the Planning Commission, when they meet, asks us to bring back another version that addresses one or more items, then we do that. But we don't normally, otherwise we could be in a situation where we're presenting 10 versions of this at the next meeting. That's the rationale for that practice.
Then if that's the case, then I would recommend to everybody here is that put your comments in emails to the Planning Commission as a whole body, so then we can read those prior to the 2nd. So that way we can come prepared and can talk about some of these issues. And Matt, I'll know what's on your mind and I'll be able to think about that a little bit more than on the 2nd, because we do have to expedite these issues out the door. And same thing for parking. If we want to email each other on parking and try to hash out some of these things via email, because then that's public and we can then think about it then in terms of our actual meeting, we'll be ahead of the game. But just to discuss it at the time is unfair. It's the same thing what Matt was saying in the parking. What are we going to learn today that we aren't going to discuss tomorrow? It's going to be the same discussion. So at least if we can have the ability to communicate, if we do it via email, that's probably going to be our best option.
Well, unfortunately, no. It's if you have a group email and you all are exchanging and having a discussion, that's an electronic meeting that has to be noticed.
But if it's going to the email, the public email that's going to all commissioners, right? That format, that should be public expression of a concern, and you should be able to go into detail of that, right? That should not be a problem.
It's a public record. It's a public record, but and that's used for the members of the public to send emails to you all. Mm-hmm. If you all use that email to then have a conversation on a matter that's pending, that is a public meeting that did not get noticed in a violation of the public meetings law.
Okay. So then semantics, what if I'm an individual as a resident of Raleigh making a public comment? Is that an issue?
If it's the idea of email conversations. Okay, so I mean, if you emailed everybody individually with your comment, that's one thing. But if you emailed all the members to where everyone could reply all, and you get into a conversation, that starts to sound like a public meeting, and so you can't do that. It's better, like I said, if you pick up the phone, call someone and have a one-on-one conversation with that person, then have the same conversation with somebody else. That doesn't violate the public meetings. But having a group email where you exchange and deliberate over an agenda item, that's going to run afoul of your public meeting. That's the purpose of having the special meeting.
What if everybody just sent in one comment and we do not do a reply all, and it's not off of anybody, it's just a clean, these are my comments to this text change. Nobody reply to my email, please.
Maybe I could suggest that all comments be sent to staff, staff compile them and circulate the totality of the comments to all the commissioners, that you have them all in advance. Now, it's unlikely, given deadlines, that we'll be able to get that in the official backup materials, but it would be something that could be available for your discussion at the meeting itself. Depending on the nature of the comments, there may be an opportunity for staff to provide some response to it. It kind of depends on what it is. I mean, a comment like reduce the lot width from 100 to 90 feet is pretty easy to figure out how that goes in the code. A comment that's more general in nature may take more work, but we will do the best as we can to compile all those comments together in a format that provides structure for your deliberation at the meeting on the 2nd.
I like that suggestion. Thanks,
And
Ken.
that would, in terms of things that could be reflected in an updated staff report, we'd pretty much have to receive them by the end of today to turn them around. For stuff that we would look to have to you the day before the meeting, could probably look at close of business on Thursday.
Okay. Well, we'll all get on it. It sounds like this is important.
Okay. Are we ready now to adjourn the meeting?
One more quick thing. Commissioner Lamplin mentioned parking. If you all want to take that up after you take up ADUs, time permitting, at this reconvened meeting, that would also be a possibility.
Yes, please.
But you may want to say that that's your intent before you adjourn.
I make a motion to address parking and the ADU text change on the June 2nd meeting at 9 a.m.
Do we really need a motion, or can we just express the intent, Mr. York?
I think if you just express the intent, that's fine.
That's my intent.
That's our intent. We will do that. All right. I think we have run well past our time, and I think we have a strategy for dealing with TC 1619. And I will see you all back online again on the 2nd of June. And I encourage you to prepare your thoughts for that meeting and discuss it with individuals if you feel like you have things you want to discuss. So thank you. We're adjourned for today. I'll see you on June 2nd.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.